Good time chair right there. I'm gonna call us to order. It's 1:07. And I'm gonna do a couple of quick logistics, then I'm gonna turn it over to our host to say a few words and then we'll get started. But before we do that, I want to thank Mike Clark and his team and students who have fed us and graciously volunteered to host our first traveling meeting and without a lot of script. So we appreciate his flexibility and we have a space here for our meeting. We have a space later this evening for an engagement session. So Mike, you've set the bar particularly high for other hosts. That might be difficult, but we really, really appreciate it. So
Great.
welcome us.
Well, I'm really excited to welcome you on behalf of Orange County, right?
Yes.
And so I'd like to thank the culinary class for putting together the spread for today. I think sounds like they did a good job and looks like there's leftovers, so throughout the meeting maybe, I don't know. Welcome. The work you're doing is incredibly important. I'm really proud of education in Vermont and proud that you're looking at you're looking at the areas that you are. In particular, I couldn't miss it without saying for a while we've been talking a little bit about the need for a cohesive vision for all of Vermont. And I'm glad that this group of people is looking at that. Focusing us on, as I was thinking about what I was going to say, I'm a product of a 1900s education, actually, right? 1970 to 1988. All of the kids that are coming to school now are the product of a 2000s education. And we're headed very quickly towards the 2100s, right? So as you're thinking and as you're looking, look forward and be brave and give us a vision. That was that. They told me my time is up right there.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah. So we will do roll call and introductions for commission members. Actually, Oliver, since you're at the end of the table, why don't we, sorry, jumped in the fight. That was very unfair.
So Oliver Wilson, I'm the Vermont Independent Schools Association appointee to the commission.
Jeff Bannon, the Vermont NEA appointee to the commission.
And Cummings, Vermont Senate appointee to the commission.
Craig Bolio, Vermont Tax Commissioner, Tax Commissioners appointed to the commission.
I represent Sam Accenture of Vermont State Board of Education.
Good afternoon, John Castle, Executive Director for the Vermont Rural Education Collaborative.
Good afternoon. I am Zoe Saunders, Interim Secretary of Education.
Peter Conlon, Vermont House.
Megan Roy, I'm Chair of the Commission and here as a past Chair of the Act 173 Advisory Group.
Mike Woodlater, I'm the representative of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Paul Mace, I'm the representative of the Vermont School Boards.
Jay Nichols, representative of the Vermont Principals Association.
And on the screen, I think Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Jennings. I'm the Director of Finance and Operations for Addison Northwest School District, and I'm here representing the Vermont Association of School Business Officials.
So I just want to frame our work a little bit today before I entertain any amendments to the agenda. It's been a little bit since we've met as a full commission. I think that actually gave our subcommittees time to do some work. And in the end, I think that's important. But I want to frame our work today by being really specific about our short and long-term charge. By the bell. First, for the benefit of the public and frankly for our own membership and to sort of remind us and give us some grace, our charge and our timeline was given to us. We did not create it.
Jackson's English class will be in the conference room. Mr. Jackson's English class will be in the conference room.
So our work plan, however aggressive it may feel, it's designed to meet the deadlines that were given to us. And we are going to continue to work in good faith to do that. And we hope that both the public and our own membership understands that good faith and that our timeline is really because we're doing our best to get done the work that we were asked to do. And I also want to just reiterate for clarity, there really are two phases of this work, and that does not mean that those phases are disconnected and isolated, but final recommendations, which will be produced after a year of study and engagement, that's one part of our work. The part of our work and our task by December 15th of this year is to create a written report with preliminary findings and recommendations, including short-term cost containment considerations for the 2025 legislative session. So our work today and over the next two meetings really is on developing the content and substance of what might be in that preliminary report. So I just want to encourage us to continue to work together. That's the way that we're going to be able to produce those two things. So with that, are there any amendments to our agenda? Commission members want to propose? Okay. Hearing none, I also just wanted to clarify, we have our discussion around education finance and then a kind of discussion and document review. Those are going to end up merging together, I think. So they're listed as two separate agenda items, but I think you'll sort of hear them together. Can I get a motion to approve our September 9th minute?
So maybe.
Thanks, Jay.
Second.
Thanks, Peter. Any changes or questions folks need to make? All those in favor, by saying aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, minutes are passed. And we have the first of two opportunities for today's meeting for some public comment. It's about 1:15. I'll kind of see how many folks we have. We will get through as much of it as we can now. There is another opportunity at the end of today's meeting. And then there is also an engagement session this evening. That's not to say that you will be put off. If folks want to give public comment at this meeting, they can do so. And what I will do is if we have both members on the screen and in the room, I will alternate back and forth. And just a reminder, this is an opportunity to give input to the commission. It's not the only opportunity, but we welcome the public comment. You are not likely during public comment to receive a direct answer or response, although one may come later in the meeting. And we may take your comments as input into future meetings. We may even be able to provide a follow-up answer. So I'm going to start with a show of hands in the room. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the room. So we're going to start. I'm just going to start on this side of the room. What I'll have folks do, the folks on the screen should still raise their hand so that I can see you. I will have you give your name,
Please
your
don't
comments.
clap.
and then I will switch to the screen if there is anyone, and then we'll go back and forth.
Thank you. My name is Judy Lusk. I'm here representing Roxbury, where our school was closed last year due to Act 46 and related issues. But I have lived in Roxbury for 48 years. I taught for 33 years in Vermont, 3 of which were at the Roxbury Village School. I raised my family, and I'm currently the co-chair with Tom Frazier for the Committee for the Future of the Roxbury School Building, because we are left with probably being presented back with our school building that we will own as the town, but which will not be funded. So, but I just want to give a little something about this report from the Picus Auden. I'm not sure if that's how it's, okay. So, decades ago, probably like in the 70s, I heard that Vermont was the most rural state in the country. And the definition of rural was that the highest percentage of the population lived in towns of 2,500 or fewer students, yeah, people. And I checked it out, and as of the 2020 census, that is still true. And the largest city in Vermont is still under 50,000 population. So not only are we rural, but we're also mountainous. And we all know that means you can't get there from here. And that goes for school transportation. So the Ficus Auden report of 133 pages does not address transportation at all.
That's a big gap.
Obviously, that's a central issue in Vermont school consolidations. Presently, our Roxbury kids ride 2.5 hours a day on the bus to go to school. These were some kids who could walk to school. With this proposal by Ficus Auden, they could be riding to Williston for all we know, because that may be the place where the largest population is that they want. But the Ficus report represents a world of finance. I looked at their page, and the two people who wrote this report or have their names on it are in the world of finance, not children and education. They're not educators, and they don't represent Vermont families and communities. So I have a document here that I don't really know. We got it from Margaret McLean in a text, and doesn't really say who the group is, but there are 84 signatures. I'm sure you've all seen this. It addresses all the issues that you're looking at or should be looking at. And it has 84 signatures, and all of the people on it are educators, parents, community members, and they're all Vermonters. I don't know where Ficus Auden is from, but they're definitely not very attuned to Vermont. So I believe that this document, signed by 84 people who are all of that, should be given more consideration than the Ficus Auden report.
Thank you. Do not yet see hands on the screen. So I'm gonna go to the next person here. Yep. And I'm roughly 3 minutes. I think we have time to go over, so we're fine, but just so folks know.
Thank you. I'm David Scholes from My World. Good afternoon. The following values and recommendations are included in the document you received last week. The document that the neighbor here, my friend, just alluded to. They have been written by Vermont educators, parents, and community members who support the power of schools to enrich the lives of Vermonters. Our document is grounded in research and direct experience with Vermont schools. Any vision for Vermont schools must recognize that young children should be educated at home. High quality and equitable elementary schools with childcare, preschool, after school, and summer programs are community hubs and economic drivers. Closing schools does not fix problems, it just creates different ones. Closing schools is damaging to children. Studies of school closures show that students experience a loss of connectedness with peers and communities, and they face increased mental health challenges. This research also shows that in the short term, they have lower test scores, worse attendance, and develop behavioral issues. In the long term, research finds they are less likely than their peers to complete college and secure a job. It also shows they face negative impacts from declining family and community engagement. Closing schools does not save money. National research shows that per pupil spending tends to increase post-closure, while anticipated cost efficiencies from economies of scale rarely materialize. Children from closed schools still need an education. Transportation costs increase. The promised greater opportunities cost money, and empty public buildings still need to be maintained. School closures most often result in redistribution of funds rather than savings. Again, community and context matter. Research clearly proves that closing schools does not save money. It just creates different problems. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so the two folks have turned their cameras on the screen, which may mean you want to make a comment. Dell Waterhouse, did you want to make a comment?
No,
Sorry.
thank you.
Okay, sorry. Making assumption. Michael Livingston, I noticed your camera is on. Nope, okay. Then we can go to the next person in the room.
It's being passed to me. My name is Alan Gilbert. I live in Worcester, where there have been some discussions lately of closing our school. I'm going to continue with the information that's in the packet that you got and that David just referred to. Closing schools impacts equity. Research finds that students experiencing poverty, students of color, and those with special needs are most negatively impacted by school closures. Closing schools also negatively impacts communities. In communities where schools are closed, research points to depopulation, declining home values, eroding social capital, and problems with attracting and retaining families with children. We're already beginning to feel a little bit of this in our town as people are worried that their school might be closed. Closing schools without due process results in unintended consequences. Only an inclusive, open-minded analysis of the pros and cons of closure results in a decision that is supported by the majority of voters. Sufficient time to clarify a path forward and plan for the future can avoid unintended consequences. Examples include excessively long bus rides, which my children can attest to, and abandoned school buildings with no clear educational plan for their reuse. This is playing out, as you've heard, in the Roxbury-Montpelier district as Roxbury, a community of 42 square miles that does not border Montpelier geographically, deals with long bus rides, as you've heard, for young children, and an empty school building with no plan for reuse. A fair and thorough analysis of the issue, the development of a clear plan, and a vote by the community could have avoided these consequences of a school closure decision made too soon. Vermont's children and their communities deserve no less. We should approach school closure with clearly articulated due process requirements. If a school becomes unsustainable due to enrollment decline and the district is considering school closure, a clear process should be articulated. Neutral facilitators should be hired to lead a study process involving community members through a comprehensive analysis of the pros and cons of remaining open, repurposing, or closure. Each option should be documented and presented as a choice for communities to vote on. A town vote on school closure is an essential element to ensure that due process is attained. It will ensure that the planning process has resulted in comprehensive plans and avoids unintended consequences. And finally, a state policy to close schools based on arbitrary numbers has no educational rationale. Small schools for elementary students can be exemplary schools. Multi-age classrooms are developmentally appropriate settings for young children. Many small schools are cost-effective and among the best performing schools in Vermont. Declining enrollment to the point of unsustainability is the only legitimate educational rationale for closures of schools that otherwise meet state standards and are cost-effective. Thank you.
Thank you. Continuing around the room.
Margaret McLean from Peacham. We need creative thinking to solve the fiscal issues we face. The hidden percent of enrollment decline exists in schools of all sizes. Creative options should be encouraged. Support should be available. High schools with dwindling numbers in AP and other elective classes. Middle school programs in pre-K to 8 with unsustainable numbers in grades 7 and 8. Elementary schools with single grade classes who can decrease staffing and move to multi-age classrooms. The need for repurposing of buildings to use as licensed childcare facilities, preschools, and K-4 early childhood programs. Enrollment decline is evident in communities that are unaffordable for families. Addressing affordable housing addresses enrollment decline. Encouraging in-migration could help communities build back to sustainability. Communities must be actively involved. Scapegoating small rural communities for Vermont's fiscal crisis flies in the face of equity. It is neither a result of a factual analysis of the problem, nor is it the solution. Scaremongering around closure freezes inaction in place. It does not foster the creative energy and innovative solutions that are needed. Worse, It undermines stability, especially of staffing, which damages our education system. The Commission has the ability to unleash creativity to solve our fiscal issues. What have been the consequences of 10 years of consolidation? We do not have sufficient evidence to know. Vermont spent 31 million in tax incentives with the intent to create larger, more cost-effective districts. What have been the effects on spending? The last report to the legislature on Act 46 from 2020 contained anecdotal information from 7 of the 111 school districts impacted. It was not released until 2024. Hardly comprehensive. On town meeting day, 83% of budgets passed in single town school districts that operate within supervisory unions. Only 38 passed in merged districts. Merged districts appear to have diminished public support for public education. What is the result of such a disparity? Act 46 combined a number of supervisory unions into larger structures. Was that a promising strategy? We do not have sufficient analysis to know. What can we learn from the implementation of the law? Unless we evaluate, we move forward based on assumptions. We understand this is a complex problem. We are here as concerned citizens because we expect a nuanced and complex response. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to comment. My name is Greg Hughes, and I'm a friend of Vermont Public Education. My comment is actually a request, and that is that in addition to the policy considerations for which the Commission is responsible, I ask that the Commission keep in mind the link between Vermont's Constitution, public education, and democracy. From the beginning of our American Republic, there was one institution that our founders knew was the success of democracy, and that was public education. The concept of a system of public education was articulated by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's premise was that the future of a fledgling republic rested in the capacity of its educated citizens to contribute to its welfare. This is why 250 years ago, the framers of Vermont's first constitution knew that virtue was essential to self-government and that public education was the primary source of virtue. Vermont's founders knew that a well-educated population was the only means of ensuring Vermont's future and protecting us from autocrats and tyranny. Without a grounding in history, civics, and the ability to think critically, people can easily be manipulated, especially by social media, and authoritarian leaders can use that to their advantage. The importance of public education to the preservation of our democracy is as important today as it was 250 years ago. Public education is our best and perhaps our only resource for tackling the problems we face. Public education is also the best tool we have for creating a more just and equitable society. Unfortunately, in America today, the public education system, one of the cornerstones of our democracy, is under attack. Across the nation, conservative billionaires are funding coordinated efforts to dismantle public education. Under the false premise of school choice, state legislatures are adopting or expanding private school vouchers that drain dollars from their state budgets and public education systems to fund unaccountable private schools. We need to be aware that when a state such as Vermont sanctions a separate but unequal education system outside our public schools, children are exposed to a higher risk of inequitable and discriminatory treatment. This practice leaves students who have been historically and systematically marginalized left behind in a public education system with dwindling funding. The future of Vermont will require educated citizens. Failure is not an option here. The stakes are too high. Our current system is not working for our taxpayers. As we look for the root causes of our problems and discuss how to support our public education system in a sustainable way, we will need to find common ground. May I suggest that the Commission stay grounded in Vermont's constitutional history? Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, and just double checking the screen. Dale, are you raising your hand to speak or just agreeing? Sorry, I don't mean to pick on you. I just want to make sure.
Well, thank you.
My name is Jeannie Albert. I'm from Lincoln, and I want to thank my friends here. I'm going to provide just the last part of the document that we submitted, and that is available on the Commission's website. So thank you very much for posting that. We want to finish with some strategies to address the current fiscal challenges. The first, clearly define the problem prior to deciding solutions. Second, include effects of COVID and inflation. The impact of COVID and inflation on the education system should be factored into any analysis of the current crisis. Third, require appropriate uses of the education fund. We're recommending examining Vermont's education fund and removing any items that are not directly related to the core mission of pre-K to 12 education. This includes items such as pensions, mental health services, school construction, and dual enrollment. These should be reviewed for potential reallocation to other funding sources rather than increase the burden on property taxes. The fourth, control healthcare costs. I don't think any of these are that much of a surprise, but they're very important, so we've included them. Affordable healthcare is a state goal. Current levels of increase are unsustainable. Fifth, ensure equitable access to mental health services. All schools need equal access to mental health services. This should not be driving up costs for some school districts due to inequitable access. Sixth, increase opportunities for collaboration between districts and supervisory unions, such as expanded funding for the newly enacted Board of Cooperative Education Services, BOCES initiative. 7, use income rather than property to determine education tax rates. Using income as the basis for education taxes would be more equitable, transparent, and simpler to implement. And 8, expand the availability of affordable housing. Declining enrollment impacts schools of all sizes. Communities across the state are unaffordable for young Vermont families because of the high purchase cost of homes and rentals. And I also just want to make sure people know that we did include in our document links to supporting research. So I hope that that will be helpful to the commission and to others. And I want to thank you very much for consideration of our suggestions and concerns.
And that is the document that I referenced in.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know we're pressed for time already, but the unusual case is I don't have a lot to say today. I just wanted to echo what Mike said. Thank you all and all members of the subcommittees for taking on this monumental task and doing it in a thoughtful and transparent way.
Any other members of the public? There is another opportunity in that. Okay. So I'm going to move us on. So next is standing agenda item, which is just a report out of our various subcommittees. Again, the goal of this is to connect the dots of our work so that folks don't feel like they're missing. So I don't know if a member of the steering group wants to just give a quick summary of September 16th. Don't remember, that was mainly an agenda planning meeting, but anybody want to jump in? Yes, I would just say, the steering group's charge is to keep the work of the commission moving forward. And I would say, in terms of steering the agenda, I just wrote myself a note. It's really, the steering group was hoping that our agenda would include an in-depth report out and discussion from the Education Finance Subcommittee, since that is that short-term charge coming up is our most pressing one. And so that's really the impetus for the multiple meetings that the Finance Committee has had between September and the state. So that's the update from the steering group. If it's okay with the Finance Subcommittee, I'm going to skip your update since you are the substance of our discussion today. And Communication and Engagement Subcommittee, I'll start, but folks can jump in. We've met twice with 2 priorities. One is to execute the request for proposals to bring in a communication and engagement consultant. Sorry, we have feedback. I think we're better. Okay. That is in process, so we appreciate the work on that. We have had a number of inquiries, and we, at our next meeting, we will likely be at the point of reviewing proposals. And the second, frankly, was planning the input session that we had for this evening. We did not want to wait until we brought a consultant in to start our engagement sessions, and so I appreciate the work of the subcommittee in planning this evening. Thanks, some of you folks would add.
I'll just add real quickly, if you see things tonight, you're like, wow, we should not do that again. Or things that work particularly well, obviously, please let us know as today's beta test.
Yes. That's the right way to phrase it. Commission members, do you have any questions for any of the subcommittees? Yeah.
Just, we talked last time, Peter, not to put you on the spot, about you providing an update on the school construction task force. I don't know if you could do that. That's okay.
Please do.
Sure. So we have this other group that's going on. It's strictly legislators, plus the deputy secretary from the Agency of Education, discussing and coming up with proposed legislation for a school construction aid program. So I think that they're at the point where they've come up with the serious questions that they need to answer. Things such as, would the function of this reside solely within the Agency of Education, or should it be an independent body? There's a number of roles that have to get involved. There's technical assistance. They're sort of deciding on awarding points for each proposal. Do you divide those among an independent body and technical staff within the agency? Does the agency need additional staff in order to make this happen? So these are, I think, so they're looking at those questions. And I think at their next meeting, and they are meeting now pretty frequently, they'll start diving into those one by one. And, and so they're moving ahead. I think that they've established that they're looking closely at the program that exists in Rhode Island and seeing what versions of that could work in Vermont. One of the things that it needs, of course, is a sustainable revenue resource, because it's sort of based on an annual payment to subsidize bond payments that a community may have approved. And so they're moving forward despite the fact that revenue source has not been determined or voted on by the legislature, but that's the job for the next legislature. What they're working on, the structural, how is this all going to work, part of it. So that's where things stand currently.
Thank you. Segueing off of that input, this is also an opportunity for, we've talked a lot as a commission about no matter how good a job we do at engagement, we also are going to have to capitalize on existing opportunities for engagement. So whether that is that your organization has met recently, I can share that I have been asked to give an update of the commission's work to the Vermont Curriculum Leaders Association, the executive board of the Vermont Council for Special Education Administrators. Those folks are working on how they want to be engaged in this process. Zoe, I don't know if you want to do an update on kind of the agency's work.
Sure, I can. So the Agency of Education is launching the third phase of our Listen and Learn tour. And that will start tomorrow with the public engagement sessions. So the Listen and Learn tour is designed to part of the agency's strategic planning process to really ensure that we can align our work to the needs and the priorities of communities across Vermont, and also paying attention to short-term needs along with being able to create synergy with work of the commission to preparing ourselves to support the future needs of Vermont in the long term. So we're very excited to start these engagement sessions. We are hosting them at 7 in-person locations across Vermont, along with 2 virtual sessions. We have received interest from others to get involved. And so as we move through this first phase of public engagement, we are evaluating the need to offer more sessions to support this process. But this is building off of the work we've done in phase 1 and phase 2. So phase 1 of our process was really collecting and analyzing data and working with our education leaders to help structure this approach. Phase 2 was focused on regional planning. And when we approached the regions, we asked ourselves the question of how do we define the regions? And we used the boundaries that are defined by the Regional Superintendents Association, because that's how many education leaders are already collaborating. And we hosted planning sessions across the state over the past month and a half, engaging over 250 education leaders. We had breakout sessions where we talked about how we can support expanding college and career readiness, promoting improvements in literacy and math, supporting the mental health needs of our students. And we had also conversations specifically with our school board members around what data would be helpful to inform this existing budgeting cycle as we move forward. We have hired the education finance consultant who is supporting us with some initial reports and also helping us to expand the type of educational trainings we can provide to the community, along with targeting to school leaders across the state for this cycle. So we're very much looking sessions tomorrow. Encourage all Vermonters to participate. We are inviting everyone, parents, family members, community partners, businesses who would like to be part of that to share their input and really have a two-way dialogue. It's structured to promote informed input. So as people arrive, we'll provide some background information with some high-level data and context around the education system in Vermont, along with what we've already heard through our Listen and Learn tour. And then we'll have smaller conversations to promote two-way engagement around the topic areas that are emerging as our priorities through our strategic plan to really help solidify and validate that and identify if there's any different themes that might emerge as we're engaging with communities. In addition to the public engagement sessions as part of phase 3, we're having separate sessions that are closed sessions for teachers and educators. Not all teachers and school staff are able to participate in our regional planning because of the timing. And so for each of the public engagement sessions beforehand, we're offering focus groups for our educators and teachers, and we'll also be offering virtual sessions there as well. So we're really excited to get this broad-based input. And while we're very clear to note that this process is designed to support the agency's strategic plan, so we can really help to ensure equitable educational delivery across the state, we also recognize that there's a separate and related body of work around the commission, and so are really excited to be able to identify insights that bubble up through this process that could be supportive of the work of the commission as the commission moves forward with their broader systemic recommendations for the future of education in Vermont.
Thanks, Zoe. I would just reiterate that I think that's probably the clearest example of the goal is not to work at cross purposes with any either work of the agency or frankly work of individual organizations around these issues. More information is always going to be helpful to the commission. We realize that we're going to have to figure out how to be clear, which engagement session am I sitting at and what's my purpose. I think that we'll have to navigate that. These are two separate and distinct groups doing similar work, and the goal is to make them work well together. So I would add that. And I think one of the things that, and this may be something the steering group thinks about as it considers the agenda planning structure of our meetings is there a point, at any point, the commission should be able to say, oh, can I hear a more in-depth summary of your conversation? Or frankly, I in December, maybe sitting with the special education advisory panel. Hey, Megan, can you give a deeper update about what the advisory panel? So I think this commission needs to feel comfortable to say, I think I'd like some more information from any one of these things that's already going on. And I think that's the best way to actually work.
We are really, from the agency perspective, trying to be strategic around that. So we actually accelerated our phase 3 with the intent of concluding our public engagement session before the commission hired the consultant and started the public engagement in earnest with the idea that we could build on the learning that we had through the agency's outreach efforts. So we're trying to be very intentional about capturing that, ensuring that as a way to support both bodies of work.
Commission, any questions from any of those agents?
I guess I have a question in terms of tonight's session.
Yeah.
Is sort of caught in between pre-consultant support and Listen and Learn is underway. And I know I've gotten some questions from people being like, so are you guys doing this thing or what's the commission? So I think, I'm grateful that seems like moving forward, the sequencing will allow us to be clearer. But I just want to name that there's some confusion out there right now about the difference between listen and learn and the commission's work. I'm not sure what to expect tonight in terms of public input. And I'm hopeful that once we have a consultant, the support of an expert in these matters, not that you all aren't fabulous, but can really help us sort of up our game in terms of outreach for these events.
I would echo that. As chair, I've had a couple of questions around what is the session? And I also, though, would just reiterate that the Communication and Engagement Subcommittee, in its report back to this commission at our last meeting, said, I don't think that it will be received well if we wait, because that's just waiting longer to welcome the public in. And so good, bad, or indifferent, that's sort of the decision. But that really was about, if it's November that we secure a consultant, it still would be a little bit of time after that before we have sessions, and all of a sudden you're past the new year. And that didn't feel great to this commission. So that's what I would say to the public is part of the reason why it may feel a little confusing at first, but I think we'll do our best. And I think we'll have a good initial conversation tonight. Right. Thank you, folks. So next agenda item, this is really, and I think what I will do, this commission has tended to just want to plow through and not take breaks. So I'm going to operate as if that is still what folks want to do. Feel free to raise your hand at some point in maybe 45 minutes or so if people desperately need a break, but obviously if you need to step away, get seconds on lunch, feel free to do that. Here's how I would frame the discussion similarly to kind of how I started the meeting, which is we've got a short-term and a long-term task. And obviously they are connected, but we really need to zero our focus in on the short-term deliverable, which is a preliminary report and short-term cost containment strategies. That's the language in the law. So to give the commission as much time to discuss this as possible, we've asked the finance subcommittee to give us an in-depth update as to the work that it's done over the past number of days. Emily Kornheiser, the external member and chair of that subcommittee, is joining us online. So what I'd like to do is ask the finance subcommittee to start with that update, whatever format they've decided to give us. Then we'll just start with questions for the subcommittee. Once we move to discussion, ask the questions really be like concrete questions in the short term. We then will have a more robust discussion. And I will likely go all the way around so that each member can kind of react to what they heard in a couple of questions. I'll frame that a little bit, but update from the finance subcommittee in whatever format, and then time for questions. I believe our chair. All right, Emily, I think you are up.
Hi, Emily Kornheiser, State Representative from Brattleboro and Chair of the Finance Subcommittee, as well as the only member of the Finance Subcommittee that is not on the full commission, and I believe with you today. I'm sorry to be virtual, and I'm also sorry that I need to leave at 3 o'clock on the dot to attend a different meeting. So I will catch up with the members of the Finance Subcommittee who are staying with you. I appreciate that Megan kicked off the meeting with a reminder that you all are working with timelines that you did not create and were given to you. I understand that those timelines were given to you by the legislature, of which I am a member, and I did vote for those timelines to go into law. However, I am as chair of the Finance Subcommittee, we are struggling with those timelines. And so what we are going to bring you today is more of a process update than a recommendations package, though we do still have some time before December 15th to continue working with you all. So I'd like to tell you sort of where we've gone and where I think we are going, if that works for you. So, and I can't see anyone's faces at all, so please yell out. Okay, thanks. So we have met 3 times, really 2 of those were substantive meetings. We are now meeting every 2 weeks, which is great for us to be able to work through things, but frankly is not a lot of time for witnesses or especially analysis to be done in between meetings. And so I just sort of want to name that that's part of what we are working through. But we do recognize the urgency and are meeting as often and working as diligently as we can to deliver these short-term recommendations to you all. We understand that there is political urgency this session, and we want to make sure that the legislature is as informed as possible when the session begins. And so we understand the need beyond the statutory obligation to meet that December 15th deadline. So we began our work really looking at what are the central cost drivers, and then what would be policies to meet or shift those cost drivers. We divided our work in a brainstorming session that I think a few of you, many of you participated in, and other folks can have access to in our notes around sort of ideas around minimizing cost drivers, or essentially reducing costs, ways of reducing tax responsibility or reducing taxes that might be separate from reducing costs, and then some other sort of policy levers. When we, one of the pieces of this that is interesting, that I'm sure you all as a full commission are grappling with, is that we all, and I think all of the folks who gave public comment that I heard already this morning, is that we all come into this work very full up with both our own experiences and our own assumptions. And it is very important that we have some degree of robust data to help us check those assumptions and make sure that we are making decisions based on what is and not what we wish was there or what we think is there. And so the question of what are the central cost drivers and what are they related to is one that actually the Finance Subcommittee is still grappling with. We have not been able to get the level of data analysis that we need yet in order to answer that question. We have assumptions about what the top 5 cost drivers are in sort of the increasing property taxes that Vermonters are paying, but we do not have that correlated with school size or demographics or a number of other things that would be really helpful for us to really get down into what are the core drivers of those cost drivers. And that is something that we continue to hope for from the Agency of Education, and sort of referring to your last conversation around consultants, really would like some robust support for as a subcommittee in order for us to do our work well. So I just sort of want to flag that. So we've been moving forward with essentially some assumptions around what cost drivers are. Those being healthcare costs, mental health for students, staffing costs and classroom size as related to that, tuitioning and special education costs, as well as sort of infrastructure costs. So we brainstormed essentially strategies for lowering costs related to those things. And our next task after that is to say which of these are short-term, are there short-term solutions for, and which of these are there long-term solutions for. And I'll spend a moment on that in a minute. So in this brainstorm, we discussed ways of reducing the expansion of spending related to tuitioning, designating, limiting tuition payments to average announced tuition, only having tuition costs to approved providers. Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. And then school sizes. So in further incentivizing or mandating school mergers, establishing optimal school sizes, closing small schools, merging small schools and districts, adjusting staffing ratios by establishing minimum class sizes, and addressing staff to student ratios. Those are all sort of similar and in a cluster, but the exact policy tool is what sort of still would need to be decided. And again, I'm really essentially just sharing with you a brainstorm at this point, a somewhat evidence-based brainstorm. Healthcare costs, ways of addressing healthcare costs related to reference-based costs, reference-based pricing, statewide bargaining solutions, and sort of onwards from there. And then staffing costs are, of course, related to that. Special education costs, implementing the upstream special education services that we've been talking about for quite a while in Vermont, mandating cost limits for therapeutic schools, and then state support for schools, which includes additional administrative support or standards from the Agency of Education to reduce district level admin costs, and strengthening designated agencies' ability to collaborate with schools. That's on the mental health side. And so those are sort of all of the, within the school system, brainstorm on reducing costs. As anyone who has worked with or in schools can recognize, the vast majority of those, if they were sort of mandated in a single year, would cause a great degree of chaos. And they're all possible with meaningful, structured, careful, studied intervention. And so really deciding what sort of short, medium, and long-term steps would be related to each of those is what some of the next steps of our work looks like. And I would love to hear from you all about your thoughts on that. And then sort of deeper in the taxes and further away from the spending, we have ideas around adjusting the current non-property revenues into the education fund, diversifying those revenue sources, revenue into those. That includes expanding sales taxes, services, taxing the wealthiest Vermonters, property tax surcharge on second homes, going entirely to the income base for education funds. Those are all sort of ways of getting more money or different money into the education fund. And then there are questions around adjusting the structure of the education fund that have already come up today. Moving expenses that local districts cannot necessarily control out of the education fund and into, say, the general fund. Adding a statutory requirement that new programs have a sustainable funding source, a new revenue source into the education fund. And then there's sort of a grouping of policy strategies that adjust the funding formula, not to sort of create new revenue, but to link spending to impacts more clearly. And so that's changes to the CLA, tying local votes more closely to local district tax rates, which has been sort of something we've been moving away from. And using the education funding formula to mitigate impacts and incentives that might lead to higher spending in the system as a whole. And the last thing on this great brainstorm is setting clear targets for appropriate per pupil spending and setting education fund incentives to meet that best practice. And the recent PICUS report, which was not a product of this subcommittee, was actually a product of a legislative request, sort of speaks to that last one. So at our last committee meeting, we essentially dug deeper into some of the policy tools that are already in motion related to these strategies to find out what progress looked like, what costs would look like, and what expanding those strategies might look like going forward. And we are going to, again, continue the work to get a little more data around these cost drivers from the Agency of Education, as well as diving into what timelines and interventions might look like for this work. I just want to acknowledge we've spent significant time in the committee acknowledging this, but I want to do it for everyone here, that given the timing of and I'm sure everyone already knows this, but I just think it's important to say again, given the timing of our education budget cycles, by December 15th, most schools will have finished their budgeting process for the next year. Any interventions from this commission or from the full legislature at that point will by default be quite disruptive to that process. It is very hard to get legislation completely passed into the governor's desk by town meeting break, which is when many budget votes happen. And so our options for sort of structural change legislatively related to this next budget cycle are quite limited. And that is an important part of how we are going to be structuring recommendations and sort of these short, medium, and long-term systems. The other thing that we've talked some about, and we will discuss more at future meetings, is just how necessarily related all these are, that this is a system, it's a system made of people, many children, many people who are incredibly stressed at work, teachers, paraeducators. And in order to do anything, we're going to need to make sure that the folks who are actually in schools that we are all here talking about today are deeply supported through any of the transitions we make. And so I am going to pause there. I think I've just spoken really fast with a lot of words.
Thank you, Emily. I invite other finance subcommittee members to add, flesh out. Before we do questions, we'll start there. Does anybody have anything to add?
It accurately captures. Yeah.
Perfect. Appreciate that, Emily, for sure. It is hard to encapsulate multiple meetings in a row of something that's still conversational. And I think that's the biggest thing. The goal is to surface the conversation as early as possible so that we, the commission, can engage. So let's start with questions. Does the commission have questions for the subcommittee?
I've got one, but maybe a little complex.
Go for it.
So I'm just wondering, Emily, this is Jay Nichols, Emily, I know you can't see me, and the rest of the finance subcommittee. Is that committee saying that it's going to be very hard to really have any substantive general recommendations for the legislature in terms of cost containment for this upcoming legislative session in this budget cycle? I'm just putting it out there, asking the question.
I don't think we've had enough of a conversation to answer that question. I am saying as a person inside the screen that I think it's going to be hard, but I don't think we have come as a collective group yet to the decision that it would be difficult.
We have talked about the fact that, like it or not, ideas are put on the table. And so if there are ideas that we believe are worth exploring or have merit, that I think there's collective agreement to putting them on the table and not arriving in January to legislative conversations with nothing to contribute.
Yeah.
But recognizing it's complex, and the fact that budgets are being built as we speak makes it the timing difficult, as it always is.
I think one of the other complexities is just the percentage increase in our local budgets, which impacts the tax rate. And that's one of the other pieces we've talked about. And Emily has done a good job of leading us in discussion with some of what some of those actual increases are, what some of those impacts are, but also talking about and offering some suggestions that could bring relief to the education fund, knowing that there's a deficit going into this next legislative session that's going to impact our taxpayers and what they hear about our local budgets.
Well, because of the season we're in, one of the things I'm somewhat sensitive to is being accused of ignoring recommendations from the administration. And so I just want to make sure, maybe asking the two members of the administration who are on the subcommittee, are those recommendations, are you feeling fully heard? Could you talk a little bit about the recommendations that specifically you folks brought to this? And is there anything that you feel isn't being heard?
I'll let you go first and I can talk about some of the things we're hearing on the ground.
Yeah, sure. You'll be able to speak to the on the ground stuff better. I mean, in terms of the brainstorming and working as a committee, Zoe, if you feel differently, but I do feel like All the ideas are being heard right now. I agree with Emily that, there hasn't been enough discussion to sort of coalesce around what those final recommendations are. But I don't feel like anybody's been shooting down ideas from the first moment of interest.
I would say there's a general recognition that we need to limit spending, right? And also an acknowledgement that that's quite challenging. So one of the things we've talked about as a committee is not prejudging the strategy, right? Being able, as Nicole said, to name that, and explore what are some, implementation challenges that might come with that. I think getting concrete in the next phase will be important in terms of establishing thresholds, right? How do we actually think about operationalizing these strategies? That's a next step. It's one thing to talk about class size, but what does that mean? And what does that mean as you're looking at different size schools, right? And so being able to look at these strategies, I think, there's a limited menu of options. Many of them have been explored before. And it's taking next step around what in the Vermont context, why might that be challenging to implement? And what are some things that can be really concrete and really evaluating the implementation. I think something else we've talked about as a committee is that the recommendations would be recommendations. And so being able to have buy-in support around that would be helpful because it won't come with teeth of legislation, right? And so that's, I think, where there's a great benefit in building on the engagement that all of our teams are doing in both the commission in its own right and our partners. Because what I know we're hearing from in our listen and learn for so many of the education leaders say, if we had clearer parameters around, what the goals are and what the tools and strategies we could employ, we could come to the table and come up with some really great recommendations that we think would not only impact spending, but would also improve quality. But sometimes our structure is a little bit limiting to allowing that. And I think that BSA and BSBA have shared that too, and their recommendations. So I think our next phase is to really begin to get really concrete and understanding what could that look like. Because I know that districts and superintendents, and school board members are very interested in exploring this, but it also has to be in a fair way, right? There needs to be an expectation that it's not just one district that's looking to do this and look at affordability. It has to be a shared approach. And I think that continues to be a challenge, right? We want to make sure that there's local control, there's local input around what's best for communities, while also recognizing that there's a shared community of Vermont students. And so that's the tension that we have as we go forward with these concrete recommendations. But overall, at least what we're hearing from listening and enjoy is a lot of engagement, understanding that many changes are needed and are actually beneficial for educational delivery for students. But we need clearer parameters and understanding of the tools that could be deployed.
Very much.
Two things I'd love, sort of a question I'd love to ask everyone or sort of put on the table, is that one sort of tension that we have not surfaced yet as a subcommittee, is the idea that policy change can drive cost reductions versus fiscal tools can drive policy change. And those two things don't necessarily have to be in tension, but they often are in these conversations. And it might be helpful for the finance committee to be hearing the full commission sort of talking about those ideas. The idea that you could sort of change the tax structure and the kinds of sort of structural and policy things we want to happen would happen as a result of that. They'd be sort of incentivized by dollars or lack of dollars versus we make policy changes that they say the Agency of Education would lead on that might lead to cost reductions down the line. So that tension would be really helpful for, I think, for us to have explored by a larger group of people. Just want to sort of also name that at our next meeting this coming Monday, a week from today, we're going to sort of take a national view for the bulk of the meeting to hear both a deeper dive on the PICUS report, what the agency has sort of learned about how other states tackle these kinds of issues, as well as hear from some national folks about possible short-term strategies. One thing that I have noticed, and I think it's really important to name, that's already come up today in some of the public comment, as well as some of the education, the subcommittee's brainstorm, is that usually when you sort of national experts on this, when they look across states about what short-term cost containment looks like, generally what that looks like is various strategies of moving things between district budgets and state budgets, and sort of cost shifting as a way of reducing costs. Because in other states, it's not all coming out of the same fund in the end, right? And so those short-term cost containment strategies that might work in a state where the local taxes are entirely separate from the education taxes don't make as much sense here in Vermont. And so sort of similarly, it's moving costs between the general fund and the education fund can often also feel like a wash. And so I think that's sort of another tension that might be helpful to have fleshed out a little bit more by everyone.
I think when we started, one of the first things we agreed upon was that nothing can be off the table. That we first started with, I forget the name, it's a Google board that you stick stickers on, and it was anonymous. So you could put up any of your thoughts, but that we have to have an open mind as to what this might be. Personally, just listening today and reading some of the input, I think we're kind of handicapped because we don't have anyone here from anyone. Well, when we talk about switching costs to essentially it's the general fund, we don't have anyone here that can talk to us about what those consequences would be. I just know that my committee was asked to raise money so we could give a 3% increase to the community-based services like mental health, which is one we're talking about. So the budget is very tight, and we are, and the governor, we're all stuck to that agreed upon revenue forecast. So we can't just say, well, we'll hope, you know, we'll allocate $60 million and hope it shows up. If we can put it in a waterfall, but we can't allocate it.
Yeah, Jennifer, this might be a question for Zoe, but Emily, you had mentioned that the committee is waiting for data and that you're operating on assumptions, but you know, having data would really help to clarify, you know, what the drivers are. Is there a sense of the timeline of when that data might be available?
And so I can speak to that. So we have a lot of data at the agency and we produce a number of reports. I mean, I think the last count was over 400 reports that we produced to the federal government, right? So it's not a matter of data, it's a matter of making sure we're really clear on the analysis that we're prioritizing and the questions that we're seeking to answer. And so that was the conversation we had at the last Education Finance Subcommittee, is really getting clarity around that. Because there is a lot of work effort in pulling together these different analyses, and we want to make sure to what end, right? Supportive of exploring some of these strategies. So with that in mind, we are kind of a phased approach where we're really making sure we're providing clarity around the education system. So we're setting the table and making sure everyone understands the components that are baked into our system. It's really hard to think about strategies until we make sure everyone has that. So that's really the first priority of the report, is outline the system and how it compares. And then as we look at that, it becomes clearer what are some of these short-term cost containment that helps to drive the analysis to support some of what we just talked about in terms of identifying what maybe some thresholds or recommendations could be as we look tactically at those opportunities to support cost containment. And one of the things we're really being thoughtful about as the agency is, we talk about cost containment, we also need to talk about education quality. And what we're hearing a lot throughout this memo is a shift from thinking about loss, what do we lose in our system, and what do we gain for students? And so thinking about that, not just about cost, but with these strategies, what are some of the evidence-based educational practices that could be further amplified to support learning for students? And so that's where we're headed. But it is really, there are so many components of our finance system, and there's so many different requests for data, and there's a lot of analysis that we do, right? So we can produce a lot of analysis, but how do we make sure that it's really focused in helping us to support that? So we are moving forward as quickly as we can, while making sure that the foundation is really strong for understanding, so that when we're actually looking at these strategies, people understand kind of what those levers are. So we're going a little slow to go fast, right? Because we also, and as the administration, we have a sense of urgency as well, outside of the commission too, to make sure that we're being responsible as well to address some of these challenges. But we expect that the next finance subcommittee meeting, we'll be able to talk about those components of our system and make sure we really solidify the analysis that we want to prioritize.
Do you have a sense of whether there will be some band of data that will be available by December 15th of this year? Or is this something that's going to be considered?
So we have a lot of data available. Right. And I think it's a matter of how do we help to package that and make sure that it's supportive of the decision making. Yeah. Thanks.
I have a related question for the subcommittee, and it's just coming back to the consultant piece, which has been talked about a little bit in general. We know the commission agrees that engagement is really important and needs to hire a consultant in that area. And there was sort of a parking lot concept in general around the potential need for data analysis. And at one point it was, let's see what we need. The agency has, to your point, Zoe, lots of information at its fingertips. But where is the subcommittee now? And part of about whether or not we need to kick off that process. And it's the process part that makes me want to ask that question, what the request for proposal process looks like. It takes time. So is the subcommittee thinking that is necessary, or does it feel like through the consultants that the agency has right now? I guess I would just say, what was that conversation?
I think we're putting the agency in a really awkward position, asking them to prioritize amongst their existing work with the work, what they're trying to do to, what the interim secretary is trying to do to rebuild the agency, strengthen the agency, communicate with the field, just even keep the trains running, to prioritize all of that and the needs of the finance committee. And so I think by not having a specific consultant working on this, we are sort of short shrifting the agency and their ability to do their own work, and not giving the committee the resources that it needs to do its work. There's the sort of initial data ask that we have around actually understanding the problem we're trying to solve. But once we understand that and we have solutions, we're actually going to need to model the impact of those possible solutions on, the most rural communities, the most demographically diverse communities, those communities that tend to not pass their budgets, those communities that always do, right? We need to understand the impacts of any of our ideas, and that's another pretty significant modeling lift. And so I do think that we need pretty significant support for the next couple months to be doing this work.
The one piece I would bring up, just the process component, is even if we bring in additional resources, all that data is currently housed and structured within the agency. And so a lot of the pre-work has been organizing some disparate data collections in a way that can be mapped. And that work can really only be done internally before it's handed over to a consultant. So just sharing that's the real deep and intensive systematic work we've been doing at the agency, so that the consultant can actually help us to do some of the deeper analytics. And the scope of work within that consultant is also to support with modeling. So I just want to share that even if we bring in additional resources, there is the work of the agency is part of that. So we would just need to be thoughtful around how we would structure that scope of work, understanding that the data validation piece and the data mapping is still required within the agency before those files can be shared with the consultant to do any higher level analysis. So part of what we're talking about as we do this work is we are intentionally building capacity of the agency, right? And providing, creating greater accessibility to data to support this type of analytics in the field, right? But it is a process. So I just wanted to share that because we are moving into being able to accelerate that after doing a lot of that data cleaning across these disparate collections that historically have not been mapped in this way, to do the type of analysis that I think is needed and that we want to deliver to inform policy. So not that I'm opposed to having additional resources. I just wanted to share that we would need to kind of still ready, if you will, the data sets for it. No, no. It's more time to walk.
It does. I just want to I want to like affirm what Zoe said. Anyone who's worked in a school district knows that hiring a consultant is great, but you usually need the work behind the scenes to generate what the consultant needs. And so it doesn't take all of that off. And not, I'm not shifting the conversation yet because I want to make sure all the questions come out, but one of the kind of what I will ask to kick off the discussion part is one of the things this report may state is, here is the modeling that needs to be done, in which areas and how. Because we likely won't be able to turn some of it around by December. So I just want to surface that yes, we need to give ourselves as much of a chance as we can for concrete recommendations, but sometimes surfacing issues is just as important because the General Assembly can, there's time in between there. So I just want to acknowledge that when we move to that, that's part of what we want to surface is.
Well, I think we need to square it away pretty quickly because this commission's been meeting since July, August. And I would hope that we could actually have a report to the legislature that is informed by some level of data. And so I'm, I think part of it is that the data's not been clean, it's not ready. But I also have heard some questions around like, what is it that you want? And so I feel like I've been clear what kind of information we need in order to really inform the work that we do. And maybe others feel the same way, but it feels like we've spent a couple meetings sort of going back and forth around what is it that you want? Do you want this? And I felt like I've been clear, but maybe everybody else isn't clear. So I think that we need to just establish quickly, here's a small subset of data that we need. And then how's the best way to get it? Is it something the agency can produce, which in my observation of years in the legislature, it can happen when it's been asked for. And so I don't want to get to a place where the legislature has more information in January than we've had for the last 4 to 5 months. So I'm not sure what the best way is to move that, but I think to Emily's point around what are the core cost drivers, we have a lot of beliefs about what they are, but we can't measure them and we don't have any numbers behind them to say, 52% of ed spending is dedicated to this specific, to instruction versus mental health versus administration.
And I would agree, and I also see Elizabeth in the call, so I don't want to speak for her, but having a person who sits in the superintendent's chair through requests for data, a lot of times those agency of education requests come to our finance directors, who also are a mechanism who can help produce that information. Elizabeth has a lot of information and knowledge, more so than I do, on this topic.
Yeah. Can we spend a few minutes and maybe start with members of the finance subcommittee? What are those? Can we start? What I'm hearing is we do know what we want to know. And can we put that out on the table in front of this group and then get a health check?
We've done it quite comprehensively in multiple meetings, and I don't have it right in front of me here. It feels
So I can.
I feel like maybe our time here could be spent in a different way than us sort of surfacing that list again, though I can try to look it up while we're talking about other things.
I think some things that we're working on, we've talked about is doing the analysis by function and object code. So we're actually understanding how we're spending those dollars over time, and that'll get at instructional versus facility. There are some buckets of information we'd like to see, but we don't collect in the way that's clean, like mental health. And so part of what the agency's been doing as our listen and learn tour, for those of you that have been part of it, is saying, here's a methodology we're looking to use to quantify mental health costs to get feedback. Right, so where it's not clear in our uniform chart of accounts and how we're putting it, we're working with the field to try to capture that, at least an approximate. The other thing we've talked about is similar to how we did the state profile report. We looked at an analysis, we looked at analysis by size of supervisory unions. We've talked at our finance committee to look at analysis by spending also, and then maybe looking at either 4 or 5 groups of spending, depending on how that analysis plays out, and also factoring in those nuances related to need. So what we saw and what we've seen in our analysis so far is that our smaller supervisory unions and districts tend to serve higher need students. They tend to serve students who have more students that qualify for free and reduced lunch, more students that receive special education services. And yet due to budget constraints, they also tend to pay their teachers less, right? So these are kind of macro trends we're seeing. And then, so as we're starting to break this out by spending overall, we're looking to model spending and performance, right? And how do we look at that in relation to think about how those dollars are invested to support the overall needs of students and their academic achievement. But that need component is also critical, right? Because we've talked about the fact that there are a lot of other outside needs and supports that many students require that we need to account for as we're doing that analysis. So to kind of summarize, I think we're looking at trends in spending by function and object code. We're looking at organizing it by groups of spending to see what patterns and how those patterns play out according to need and also geography as well are some of the key pieces. And then there's some statewide cost drivers, I think that are outside of local control that we've named in terms of healthcare costs and things of that nature to understand how those have changed over time.
And then we also want to, in addition to sort of district size, school size is another important variable. Demographics in the communities is really important and in the schools. And then to look at spending per pupil and district and school spending, not just as a whole, but by either quintiles or quartiles. So we have a sense of what do higher spending districts tend to do, what do lower spending districts tend to do. And from there, also understanding, the bulk of this conversation is often about education spending, which is sort of the part that's most closely related to tax rates for schools and that school districts have the greatest control over. But anything related to federal funds and anything related to sort of above the line in the education fund spending also has a huge impact on property tax rates. It's just slightly more indirectly. And so understanding trends and cost drivers related to those is really important as well.
Yeah, and I think too, we've often looked at statewide results, right? And so that can kind of obscure some of the variation across the state. I also think as we start this analysis, understanding that there are different operational models, and it's helpful for us to look at how certain districts and schools may operate differently than others that maybe produce more financial efficacy and greater results, right? And really being able to take that more nuanced view to highlight some of those practices that could be really promising and examples of what could work if some of these changes could be implemented in a way that's feasible and actionable.
Nicole, does that, I mean, that, or not just Nicole, but anyone from the committee, what else what else is on that list of like, do we have this or not? Kind of thing. Because that's a pretty good summary.
Yeah, that's consistent with what we've talked about. I don't want to spend another meeting and be like, is this really what you want or just not? I mean, I think we can just start from the place, and if we have more questions, we can follow the breadcrumbs at that point.
Yeah, I hear you.
I see Elizabeth's hand is up.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to add in that in regards to the information that the AOE is collecting, from business managers and districts. One thing I do see that they are trying to collect from the districts at this point is about budget information. So recent budget information and making that collection be more in correlation with what we already report for our actual spending. So there's a difference, between what we actually have spent in a past year versus what we budgeted, or what we budgeted for future year. But traditionally, those reports that are collected by the agency aren't necessarily in correlation in the same exact way. So how they collect stat book was not consistently the same way they collect budget data. And so they're moving to collect them both in the same similar manner. And so a lot of us will be resubmitting in the next week or so. I think the deadline is the end of October to resubmit our FY24 budgets in the same manner that we do our stat book of actual spending, which is going to be pretty helpful in regards to them being able to correlate budgets and actual dollars by both object and function, as they were talking about. And when I say object and function, to be a little more clear, object is like the type of expense that it is: salary, benefits, professional services, and the like. Function is like a department. So is it direct instruction? Is it special education? Is it intervention? Just to kind of add that into the conversation.
Thank you so much for acknowledging the work of the team in that way. We do recognize that we need some more granular detail. And so that's why we're doing that other collection, and really want to thank the field for supporting that. There've been a lot of conversations around, it's sometimes hard for us to ask for more information, but there's really this sense of understanding that we need more information at a statewide level to be able for the agency to be a productive partner in this space. So I just really want to thank, the business managers and superintendents and principals across the state who are really helping us with that. Because we do feel like that will be really informative as we go into this next legislative session to have more consistent trends analysis. So thank you. Peter?
I guess in listening to the sort of list of data that you're collecting and how you can slice it and dice it and all that, does the committee feel comfortable that they can also, sort of put the brakes on at a certain point and say, okay, we've got the data that we need? Because it seems like the amount of dissecting and whatnot you could do could go on forever.
Yeah.
And thereby never really having an end to the information request.
Yeah, I think what we can commit to is sharing what we have, right? And I think we have a lot of this information. Some of it is more nuanced. And I think just at least being open to some of this may require different data collection or different validation. As long as we're clear about that up front, I think we can share what you have in these key areas we've discussed.
I think the relationship between public trust in our work and having meaningful, robust, accurate, and carefully analyzed data is really important. And I'm hoping that we can at least get a first run of answering some of our questions soon, so that we can also sort of fulfill the public trust of moving forward with our work. And so it is a delicate thing to balance, but both sides of that, I think, are really important as all of us work to make Vermont's education system as great as possible.
I was gonna ask a logistical question. I'll ask it, and if it turns out that it's better to answer it after we sort of hear from the full commission. But one of the questions is like, are we at the point where, or it's when, is that like, if the agency is able to produce that amount of data, is it going to the next finance subcommittee? And also, is it coming directly to this commission? I'm sort of just trying to think ahead to the next few meetings. We have a full commission meeting on November 4th because we're a little off cadence. So we have November 4th, and then we have whatever the first Monday in December is. So
yeah, I think on the statewide trends in these areas, I feel comfortable with validation for the next meeting. Getting into that next analysis, the quintiles, is where we need some further time to do that well.
Okay.
But I think at least reflecting back on those statewide trends would be something to deliver.
if our goal is to have short-term cost containment recommendations in the legislature, it would be helpful to at least have statewide information on what are the cost drivers. Assuming we get to a place where we can come to some agreement, something to put in a written document, having some, as Emily said, we all believe what we think the cost drivers are, and it'd be really great to have that laid out.
Agreed.
Clearly.
With that, I think that I'm gonna segue us and I'll pose a question and then hear from every single commission member, which is not normally how we operate, but I think in this case it makes sense. But before I pose the question and switch to that, is there anything else, either questions for the committee or something he wants to put in the room before we start to go around? Okay, so, and I think this picks up a thread that even a couple of you, talked about. The goal is to put ideas in front of this group so that they can be surfaced and discussed and considered. And so what I would like to do is, this is a somewhat broad question, but whatever your response to it could take a smaller thread, but for each commission member, and we will go around in turn, and hear from everyone. I'd like to do this in 2 rounds and start with a broader question. And the first question is, kind of taking into consideration what you heard today from the finance committee. You all had a long reading list, and I appreciate your patience with that reading list, but I think it's really instructive. That really is a lot of background information. So taking everything you've read to date, any discussion you've had with whoever you represent, and what you've heard, what we've talked about, what is important for this preliminary report to include? So I'm gonna give us a couple of minutes just to formulate an answer, and then I would like to go around, and have every member just sort of very high level. So this question is, taking everything you've heard to date, what is important for this preliminary report to include? We'll have another question about, I'd like to zero in on short-term cost containment strategies. But this first question is a little more 10,000 foot. So I'm gonna give us about 3 minutes. Hopefully someone will volunteer to go first, and then we'll just go around the room.
You restate the first question. So the
Yes.
first question is not about December 15th, or is it?
It is. These are both, thank you. These are both about the December 15th, because the first question is, what is important for the preliminary report to include writ large? The second question is going to be about potential short-term cost containment strategies. Because we have to generate a report, and so it's both.
And within the report will be the cost containment strategy?
Yes,
Presume?
yes, hence both questions.
That's a huge big for us though. There's a secretary just on here. Like education.
For 1 minute, I'll ask for a volunteer to kick us off. Well, Elizabeth, you raised your hand, so you're gonna be the kicker. Just heads up, 1 more minute.
That he does.
Okay, so Elizabeth's on the screen and then I'm gonna go clockwise, which makes you next, Oliver. Okay. Elizabeth, go ahead. So this is just general, what should we make sure this report includes?
So my thought was kind of related to the conversation we were just having about data. And so I wanted to just make sure I connected that. Also, I don't want someone else to steal my idea before I get to speak. But basically, my thought was in regards to any recommendations that our commission brings to the December 15th, in regards to data, I echo someone else that I think mentioned this before, is questioning and bringing forth data that backs up our recommendations. And so my thoughts are, when I think about any of our cost containment short-term suggestions, I want to ask, like, is there anything in any of those, as we bring those to light? So for instance, some of the items that are in one of the documents we have listed here as for review and discussion from the VSA, VSBA, and VASBO, there are specific cost containment suggestions within that memo. And if those would drive us to need any detailed information in order to kind of walk down that path and make those as a recommendation, is there anything specific for data that we need that's different than what the agency is already providing, which is, just costs and budget and data in regards to the particular kind of spending? Is there anything that these suggestions that we bring forth are going to require for more specific data? And if that's the case, we want to make sure that we gather that now so that when we bring these as recommendations, we're backing up those recommendations with data.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think that's critical. And it makes me think that after, so we'll do this round, we'll have a round around surfacing short-term cost containment recommendations. And then we should connect those two things to say, as we prep ahead. And that doesn't mean that we're at the recommendation stage, but we have to put things on the table. So then we should ask ourselves, for each of these potential recommendations, what data do we need to know? So I appreciate that. Oliver.
So two things, bearing in mind where we're at in the budget cycle for really everyone, public schools, independent schools, everybody's sort of in the same budget cycle. I think, and knowing how short a time frame we have, I think it would be really helpful if this report could serve as sort of a call to action with some high level financial goals for everyone involved, right? And the message is, hey, we're all in this together. We're dealing with a fiscal crisis. We collectively need to work towards, growing education spending by no more than X percentage, right? So we put that marker out there, we set it as a goal, and then we're gonna have strategies that, will try to get us there, which will take time and may or may not be implemented in legislation, but at least we put a goal out there that people can start working towards as they're going through their budgeting process. So I think that's the most important thing. Second thing is, I want to pick up on something that Emily brought up before, or vis-a-vis this tension between sort of the fiscal sort of levers and that can drive policy choices at a local level, and then also the sort of statewide policy decisions that, could drive, that may or may not have fiscal implications. So I think some discussion of those philosophies is going to be really important.
Couple things, interesting, so I don't know which question you have first. I have them probably first last. I will have the potential short-term cost containment strategies as number one for me. So I will say that,
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Someone do the opposite of what we're doing.
then I'll go the other way. What is the importance?
You're gonna come back around the phase.
We know that.
I wrote them down differently, so this, what's important for the December report to include? I think it should say that much of this is out of our state's control. Healthcare, except in some respects, it is in our control at a statewide level. So, for example, healthcare, a sizable potentially cost driver, we don't know, but as you alluded to, Nicole, we need to get drilled down and figure out exactly where our cost drivers. So healthcare ought to be examined. So I'll flip over to the short-term cost, containment efforts. Emily mentioned it, reference-based pricing. It's taking place in a couple other states. They've seen sizable savings. And the question would be, if we were to implement it fairly soon in the legislative year and we're effective July 1, what would be that might be, I think that would be the whole fiscal year for a school, I guess, if we did it effective July 1. But even if it wasn't, what could we reasonably expect in cost savings if we move to reference-based pricing? So that might be one. And then I've seen some national data about IDEA and federal funding of schools generally, that over the last decade, while there's been an infusion of cash since the pandemic, that is, we talked about in some of these reports, is falling off. Over the last decade, it's actually dropped sizably. So it's almost $14 billion less nationally in funding under the federal education laws, as well as IDEA is down to funding of 8%, whereas the law did say upwards of 40%. So we're trickling downward, and those are things that are out of our control, but they do necessarily largely affect our budgeting in the state in sizable ways, and that ought to be mentioned. And so I think those are two or three ideas that I think we ought to consider.
I just want to make sure, did you also want,
No,
okay, I just want to make sure you're still gonna come around, okay?
Actually, I'll add one more to it. School construction, work that Peter and your group is doing. I think we ought to be thinking about that much more intentionally in the immediate moment before you roll out your work, and that's good work that you're doing. I was on the group last year that looked at this. As you begin to look at how we fund it and manage it and administer that program, I think we ought to be saying to schools, maybe hold for a minute until we get our sea legs about us in that realm. So that we're not perhaps working at cross purposes.
Just to clarify, I'm not on the current.
So I can remember who's on.
I don't want to take credit for anything that's good or bad that's going on.
Thank you for the clarification.
Even the good.
and
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that it's going to be essential that December 1st acknowledges the group that isn't here. We have a bunch of people that represent different educational groups and some legislators. The one group that isn't here, taxpayers, that maybe it's just the position I'm in, but it's pretty brutal out there, the anger that people are feeling because they're in danger of losing their housing, they're in danger of losing their retirement. So I think it's important that we not come out with an purely academic report, but one that acknowledges the pain that people are feeling. And then one that gives hope that we hear you, and this is what we're going to recommend to do this year to help you, but if you can hang on for another year, these are the things that we're exploring could help. But I think it's the tone that, and it's also important that the legislature hear that we are making progress. We are working on this. And we will find some laws that will keep us from doing things that we think we should be doing. So it's really trying to find the balance and to keep something bad from happening until we can figure out what's the good that should happen.
I would totally agree with you, Ann, on the tone and making sure that we're sort of being empathetic and sympathetic to those real fiscal challenges that are happening. A couple additional things that I had thought of was, I think we should internally define and then be really thoughtful about how we define it in the document for what we mean by cost containment strategies. I think Emily had framed it at the start that the brainstorming had done some of the ideas were like actual cost drivers and how to reduce costs. But then there was another category, which was how to reduce property taxes, which is not necessarily how to reduce costs. And being really thoughtful about making sure that the ideas are not simply cost shifting. And some of those kind of ideas can be cost shifting between districts, which doesn't actually reduce costs, but some of it can also be cost shifting between tax types, which doesn't actually reduce tax burden. And so there may be reasons to do that sometimes anyway, but we just need to be really thoughtful about that it's not necessarily panacea and all those things. The other thing that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, and isn't necessarily a short-term piece, but I also think we're gonna have to grapple with and acknowledge that some kind of discussion of funding formula change is likely needed to realize all the benefits of what we're trying to do because of the challenges with incentives in the current formula structure. And again, I don't know how short-term that is, but we're gonna be doing a bunch of stuff and districts are gonna be having a lot of really difficult conversations. And I think the current structure creates some challenges there where the districts who are having the hardest conversations are not always realizing the benefit.
It really kind of more from the 30,000-foot level. I think we need to acknowledge that the timeline was ambitious, aggressive, whatever you want to call it. And that it takes time to collect and discuss the data, because it sounds like we're not going to have all of the data we want in time to submit this by December 15th. So I think we need to acknowledge that despite all of our efforts to do that. And I think that's my second point. This is an enormous project, but I think we were all deeply engaged in getting the work done and getting it done right. Not necessarily quickly, but to get the data that we need so that we can have the discussions that we need to have. And it just takes time. And then the third thing that I've kind of been thinking about, and you sort of mentioned this, it's all connected. When I think about the cost of housing in the state, that's connected to what we're, grappling with. If teachers can't afford to buy a house and if families can't afford to stay here, people leave, school, enrollment goes down, cost per pupil goes up. So we can't just look at this in our educational silo. It really needs to be a broader conversation that we have that looks statewide at what the issues are that we're facing.
I believe very strongly that as a commission, we need to take a strong stand around equity. And I worry that in our attempt to look at cost containment, that we will roll back some of the gains that we've made in recent legislation with, say, 127. And certainly everything has to be on the table and recognize that we may need to look at funding formulas and weighting. But I would worry about us making any dramatic decisions to roll that back that would put schools that have been disadvantaged for many, many years back in a disadvantaged position.
I think in the report it'll be helpful to articulate how Vermont's education finance system compares to other states. Because there are a lot of uniquenesses to our approach. I also think data will be really critical in being able to either validate assumptions or challenge assumptions as we explore different strategies. And I agree that we need to acknowledge that schools are part of an integrated system, Vermont, that includes considerations around housing and affordability writ large. And I think building off of what Craig was saying, as we think about this work, there are some short-term cost containment. I think being able to differentiate that from the larger transformational change is helpful. And with that larger transformational change, really recognizing that there's probably three prongs to that, looking at, funding formula, structural change, and tax reform, right? And being able to name that complexity and identify those strategies of how they would work in concert together. To John's point, achieve the goals we've established, which are promoting educational quality, equity, and sustainability, right? And being able to measure against that guidepost.
I think I sort of went a little more granular in terms of things I'd like the preliminary report to have. I think we should always have pretty much everything, a look at what our enrollment trends have been and where they're going. So we have a sense of the future and what it holds for us. And probably could do the same thing with the various ratios we all have to look at between staff and the students, teachers and students, that sort of thing. Obviously, as people have mentioned, the assumptions that we think we know, if we're going to say we know them, we need to back it up with the data so that we know the myth versus reality of cost drivers. I guess I also, some information I think that'd be really good to have is what in the education fund is outside of the day-to-day sort of funding of what schools do day-to-day. And just as a, for example, enrollment, early college. I always like to bring up PCB remediation, things like that. And then maybe some sort of acknowledgement of the efforts that are taking place elsewhere on some of these cost drivers. I know that, for example, the commissions on healthcare sort of said we're going to go another 2 years on our contract so we can dive deep into the drivers and to sort of get acknowledge that work is going on and perhaps include an update to that as well. The other thing that I think is always interesting to know is due to our limited capacity as we have very stretched and small school districts and a very stretched AOE, are we leaving federal dollars on the table as a result of that lack of capacity?
I'm actually gonna put mine as a member of the committee, the point, or I guess it's an acknowledgement that I think is important. The three policy areas that we've been asked to look at: cost or finance system, delivery model, and governance. I think the report should reiterate how interconnected they are and how addressing only one or only two of them won't really get us there. For example, if it's just looking at the finance system, but we don't change how we make decisions about delivery model, which is the other two, then we may have cost containment and quality challenges, right? Or equity challenges. So and vice versa, if we only touch delivery model and not the other two. So that's similarly a 10,000 foot. And it's the only thing I'll add because others have said things that I think are important, but that's what I would, I think it's important for the report to acknowledge that. Thanks.
Well, I don't know. I'm sitting here thinking that Elizabeth was really smart at first. I keep taking notes and scratching out the notes and coming up with different pieces. But I've been asked by some of our own district residents, by people around the state and who are on the commission, whether we see this as something that is going to be just another report or is going to be something that can move the needle on affordability and quality. And I think it's important to note that if we really wants this to be both actionable and comprehensive. Taking a look again at the materials that Chair Kornheiser gave us today and the dozens of reports that have gone before us, I think if we get through this process and don't have something that looks at all those different avenues and areas and come up with something that will provide our students with a strong education and our taxpayers with the systems that they think they can support, then I think we haven't done our job, but I think we can do that. And I'm just hearing some of the ideas before us. I think we're moving in that direction. So I would say actionable and comprehensive.
Thanks. Nicole.
I agree. It's hard to go towards the end. I will say what I agree with or call out things that I think are resonate with me right now. I like the idea of a call to action. I think it's a call to action, not just to folks building budgets, but to all Vermonters to really engage in this work, because I like concrete. If we can't come up with some concrete targets for folks, I don't know what we're gonna say to the legislature. So I think we do need some guidance for the field that is actionable and that does not do damage to equity. I think we need to acknowledge that it is complex, but it's not impossible. It's just hard. And it means changing something that some faction of our community really values. And so that's not easy work, and it's a sort of all hands on deck situation. I would not want to get too detailed about where we might be heading, but I think forecasting where we might be heading to sort of lay out for folks, these are the stakes, we need you to engage. We cannot have this be another 18-month process that leads us nowhere. Or our public education system is, I think, in peril. So for folks who care about public schools, now's the time to get to work. Simple.
If I go last, now I get to go first on the next round.
Yeah.
That's fair. For real, that's fair. So my thoughts writ large on December 15th, I think there should be like essentially two separate things, consistent with what you folks all said. Cost containment strategies and specific recommendations that the General Assembly can take a look at. And then I think there should be a section in there of some sort of cost drivers that impact education finance that come in two different ways. One, have mechanisms that can be controlled by local school boards and administrators to some degree. For example, like a collectively bargained agreement, you have some control over that as you move forward. And then a second part of that, cost drivers that have no mechanism for realistic control at the local system level. Example of that I'll give is cost of healthcare, failings of our mental health services and schools having to take up those costs and support. I think those are things that we have to wrestle with as we move forward. I think the General Assembly have to wrestle with.
Oh, great. Appreciate it. Before we go back around to surface short-term cost containment ideas, anything else someone would add just based on what they heard that the report should include? And again, what we're doing is starting to zero in on an potential outline of a report so that we can then talk about each one of these things that was thrown out there. And I think if we need to do that in order to start the conversation. So now, Jay, we're gonna go back around. Unfortunately, Elizabeth, that means you'll go last. We got time.
I'm gonna say ditto.
Yes, you may say pass, you may say ditto. That goes for everyone. So second question is potential short-term cost containment ideas, some of which may already have been brought up. Again, we're not making a decision right now. We are surfacing the ideas.
Right, these are 10 considerations, just considerations, not saying I necessarily recommend any. Remove universal meals from the education fund. We're gonna fund it, put it in the general fund. Take teacher retirement away from the ed fund. Mental health expenses in schools, move back to the AHS general budget. Our general fund, high school tuition caps. Not sending money for tuition out of state and certainly not out of country, with the exception of an LEA, sending a student with a therapeutic school out of state, since we seem to have so limited options in Vermont. Not sending money to private schools that don't follow the same rules as public schools, especially in terms of inclusion for kids and financial accountability. Change the homestead tax rate, increase the percentage for second homeowners. That percentage can't be lower than the local taxpayers' percentage they pay, which in some cases happens now. So if the set rate's $1.50, I'm just making this up, in some communities, the average taxpayer might be paying $1.75, second homeowner is still paying $1.50, or whatever the rate is. So establishing some kind of a baseline with a caveat that you must pay at least a percentage of local area taxpayer base. And I'd actually like to see us look at actually increasing the amount that we have second homeowners pay. Look at, I put this in red, look at whether we want to even have a tuition system anymore as a construct, or simply a sum of the cost that it takes to educate a given student demographic and fund that way off the education. This might address the continued concern I hear from my members all the time at the elementary school level, that they're making painful programming cuts because of tuition costs they have to pay at a high school level that they don't have any say over. Instead of removing the funding support for early college, which has encouraged some of our higher achieving students to leave school early and leaving less money for the programs that are left behind. And then lastly, stop sending education public funds to early childhood education programs that don't require a licensed teacher to provide the instruction to students that are pre-K, even when we know that a licensed teacher is what the research base says we should do. So for a quick start.
You wanted to go first.
So, the associations, the School Board Association, Superintendent Association, and the Association of School Business Officers have submitted a couple of different public comments to the commission, which I found particularly helpful. Of course, my name's on one of them, but I just wanted to reiterate that I think particularly when it comes to short-term levers that could address cost drivers. So the cost drivers that have been named are personnel, facilities, tuition are some short-term or cost drivers that could respond to short-term interventions. I'll call out a couple, and if you want to call out a couple, Mike, we can do that. So first recommendation of the most recent memo was to revise the non-homestead tax category. So that started a little bit this past session in terms of short-term rentals, but I do think it could be helpful for the legislature to start to differentiate between, you know, rental properties, long-term and short-term, commercial establishments, et cetera, because it may be that we want to move to more differentiated responses depending on the nature of the property. Another thing that associations have called attention to is our over-reliance on the property tax, and I appreciate the idea of, you know, it's not coming out of this pocket, it's coming out of a different pocket, but we are an outlier when it comes to other states in terms of our reliance on the property tax. And even though we have a property tax credit, it's funded out of the ed fund, so it just raises everybody else's property taxes to pay for it because of the closed nature of the ed fund. So so I think looking at the revenue mix, but also acknowledging the fact that even though the sales and income tax has grown, costs have been added to the ed fund that had historically been paid for out of the general fund, and that places even more pressure on property taxes. So the other suggestion is some two big ticket items have been added during the COVID year, 55 million in teachers' retirement and over 20 million in universal meals. Now that's $75 million that perhaps would be more appropriately funded through a different revenue stream, either through a general fund transfer or funding it directly out of the general fund. And then the last was to the excess spending penalty, I think historically has been viewed by school boards as being like a target they want to avoid. I think it generally impacts smaller schools who tend to have higher ed spending per pupil, smaller school districts, and is really not linked in any way to cost. So there's the suggestion that the legislature consider tailoring that policy tool to be more closely linked to cost drivers as opposed to the broader ed spending for equalized people, which tends to really focus more on the smaller districts, which don't always have a big hit on the ed fund.
And along with that, I'll just emphasize that 2 weeks ago, the school business officials and superintendents had a meeting, 2-day meeting, to really dive deep into some of these issues and cost drivers and start to come up with solutions. We created long lists, and we're happy to come back and have greater discussion as we continue to kind of debate and discuss those areas, because I think it's hard in some ways to tease out, as we've talked, those long-term impact pieces from the short term. But sometimes some of those long-term pieces, the work has to start sooner rather than later and we realize the savings. So these are just some ideas that we continue on the list. We do want to put on the table. And Jay had mentioned general fund transfer for those added costs of the education fund, and having the legislature really take a look at them and grapple with them and see whether they are something that should be moved out. How should we look at some of these items? Another one that we discussed was our state law policy sets maximum class sizes, but we don't have minimum class sizes. And to really take a look at setting those minimum class sizes, amend the law to require a minimum class size average with some rurality exceptions, taking into account grade clusters and instructional areas. Speaking as a superintendent, a former high school and middle school principal, you really have to take a look, and it has to be a very nuanced pen. But we do think that there is a lot of possibilities. And then the last one we had listed, and we can go into more detail with any of these, is just to apply equitable accountability and cost containment for private schools receiving public dollars. We have a number of mechanisms to look at there as well. But again, there's some nuanced policy decisions that would have to really be considered and discussed at this table and in the legislature.
Thanks, Mike. I went last time, so I'll go this time. I'll be less specific because a lot of what I think needs to be discussed has been said, except that I would again go back to even within short-term cost containment strategies, we still need to look at all three levers. Even though we assume, I think sometimes that short-term cost containment means just the finance lever. So, again, the things that have been said so far touch on three of those. That's what I would add. Peter?
I'll be a bit of a repeat of what I said previously. Let's make sure that we are not funding things like public health initiatives, the education fund. Taking a look at those sort of add-ons that are in the educational fund, whether they continue to be something that should be funded continually, such as early college and dual enrollment. Again, looking at the capacity of everybody, thinking we build capacity in order to derive more federal revenue, and is there value in jumpstarting the BOCES process so that that could lead to perhaps better cost savings down the road, especially in terms of specialized services for students.
Peter?
So I think so far, there are a lot of short-term strategies have been mentioned. One point I'll bring out is just being thoughtful around achieving scale. And so that does require really looking at all three levers, but there are some ways as we think about their personal staffing, wearing multiple hats, looking at nutrition, not replacing those positions, thinking about how we might negotiate statewide curriculum resources and assessments and screeners and things like that to try to produce some cost savings through that process. I think some of these sharing resources is something that's come up through the BOCES. I think we have to be careful too around how to structure that in a way that's not adding additional bureaucracy and cost to our system. And so there needs to be a lot of intentionality around that as we're working with the field on how those might be structured, because in many cases, if you were a larger district with different central office staff expertise, you could rather deliver on what a BOCES would be able to do. So I think that concept of scale is really important as we're thinking about those short-term cost containment strategies, and being really thoughtful around how those short-term cost containment strategies can really fit within the Vermont context, recognizing that there is a lot of variability in terms of size and morality and need, and being thoughtful around how we might suggest those short-term cost containment strategies in the near term in the absence of broader structural change and funding is going to be really important for them to be actionable. And done in a way that's really going to still support student learning.
Would echo some of the things that have already been said regarding the pressure on the ed fund and the need to look at that very closely and consider additional general fund transfers. I think part of the challenge that we all recognize is this is such a short window of time that can we really make meaningful changes systemically or recommendations for those changes systemically in such a short window. And I think we have to recognize those limitations. And I think we have to look at longer term, I think a deeper analysis of, recent public policy such as Act 46, 127, 173. If we're going to make longer term structural changes to education financing that are coalescing with the delivery system.
So I'll just kind of piggyback on what you said, John, because when I think about the point of this report is to provide suggestions to, bring some sort of tax relief for FY 26. We don't have a whole lot of time. It really seems like maybe we should focus on, are there buckets that are currently in the ed fund that we can shift back to the gen fund? And I realize that's a little bit of, shifting cost from one column to another column. But in terms of reducing property tax rates, that really feels like the most expeditious thing that we should focus on for the short term.
Megan, I appreciated your framing of all three elements of the pillar. As the tax guy, I can only really speak with any eloquence on the financing piece. So maybe just articulate one piece that I haven't heard yet as we've gone around the table, and the system is very complicated, so there's a high risk that I trip myself up as I'm trying to work through this, but I do think when it comes to incentives in the formula, that the excess spending threshold can be used to help offset some of those challenging incentives. And what I mean by that is, for most communities, not literally all, but most districts, the lower spending districts are disadvantaged by the current system from a financial perspective. What I mean by that is that they have higher taxes than they otherwise would if all the other districts in the state spent what they spent. Inverse is also true. So the higher spending districts tend to be advantaged by the current system. Again, there are a very small number of districts in the state that carry their own spending on their homestead grand list, and so this relationship doesn't hold for them. But vast majority of districts, this is true. So when the excess spending threshold is used effectively, that helps restore some of that connection between those districts who in those communities choose to have that higher spending, therefore paying those higher taxes within that community to help offset some of those cost shifts. So given that I was sort of thinking about how formula change might be necessary, and part of this thinking about a way to do that in the short term, I think exploring if there are ways to change the excess spending threshold. Nicole, take your points about maybe there's ways to make that more targeted for things that are within distance control. Could be one tool to be effective here to undo some of those challenging outcomes.
Yeah. Only a pessimist, but I'm not sure there's anything we can realistically do to have a big enough impact on next year's tax rates to make a difference. I'm hearing a lot of switch some costs to the general fund. As I remember the finance report, we aren't looking at a big windfall of additional revenue in January. I looked to the tax commissioner on that one, but we are not, we are not looking at, $100 million more in revenue. We could play with the fifth tax bracket and put it back in. But I've been told we're gonna do that to fund universal health care, tuition-free college. We're gonna buy down the property tax rate and et cetera, et cetera. I'm pretty sure there isn't enough money to do most of that. I think we need a long-term comprehensive plan. We were told when we did the universal school meals, and it's really hard to say, fine, let kids go hungry, that you would get enough updated income certificates and the feds were going to pay for most of this. Well, the feds haven't. And so don't think about shifting universal school meals to the general fund, because the high risk is you will not have universal school meals unless we can find 20 million or $10 million. I've heard both numbers to cut out of the general fund. We already borrowed $70 million last year in one-time money from the general fund to buy the tax rates down, along with 30 million in new taxes. So I'm not sure if that 60 million probably is there this year. But if we want to switch mental health services, we're probably going to have to put the 60 million in there, or not do something else. They won't let us print money, unlike the feds. So
I don't have that technology.
I know. I keep offering to give them a printing press and we can put it in that little cellar room under appropriations, but no one will do it. So given that, we aren't in a booming economy. And anyone that's been there any amount of time knows at some point the economy is not going to boom. This is the first year the economists have said they don't think we're going to have a recession this year. But for the last 5 years, ever since we've come out of COVID, 3 or 4 years, they have given us a significant warning that we could see a recession this year. So just saying we actually got $20 million more from the sales tax during the COVID years than we would have with the old 20 million a year more. So we artificially brought down property taxes because we didn't pull that out than you would have with the general fund transfer formula that was there before. So we're coming off of, everybody isn't getting a $2,000 stimulus check and going out and buy a big screen TV, and the sales tax is back to normal. But I don't want us to think that we can fix this by transferring it to the general fund unless we have numbers that say we could raise this tax and get this amount of money to cover that. Because right now, I think Wednesday, I'm going to go up to hear another lecture on if everybody just paid their fair share. We could do everything we want and none of us would have to pay a cent more. I doubt that, but that's, we need to hear from the finance people, any one of the economists, that does the revenue forecast, and we need to base that on the reality that if we want to get 10, 20, $50 million more from the other state funds, we need to know either it's going to be there or that we can help say, these are some of the other programs you can cut. The top of the list is usually mental health and home health and all those community-based services, because it's just easy to level fund them when you need a couple million to balance the budget. And we have done that consistently. We have to acknowledge our sins. And we are where we are, but they are not in a position to give the kind of robust support that the schools need, that arguably they should be able to get. And yes, they can't get housing and they can't get mental health workers to stay any more than you can get teachers. But I just read in glorious tax-free New Hampshire, they have 3 towns that everybody's moving out of because of high housing costs and changing job markets. So it can hit anywhere, even if you're a low tax state. But we need to keep that in mind. These need to be really reality-based numbers. And we don't have anyone here on the revenue side to help us think that through.
Thanks, Sam.
So I'll continue my role as aunt at the pit.
Actually, it's a good segue. But I actually am feeling better. I think there is, I wish I had written down the number, but I thought I saw something last week that JFO or somebody predicted, revenues are up, predicted for up next year.
Well, yeah, we'll get another one in January.
Yeah.
But it's how much up and then there's how much of the costs going.
Gotcha. No, I got it understood, but it's better than the other problem. So,
Yes, oh, yes,
I'm feeling
it has been going up.
again, the short-term fix, I'll mention again, I did it twice because I wanted to. Reference-based pricing could save us a lot of money. Potentially, we need to dig into that a little bit, but we, legislature, could dig into that. I also think the ed funding system needs to be reformed, and we've been advocating for income tax, going to that. I understand quite what you're saying about which pocket doesn't matter, but the reality is that we have not made adjustments to the education funding system in some time. For example, the what I call the super circuit breaker at 47,000 hasn't, that was predates Brigham, and we're still at that number. The $90,000 threshold hasn't been adjusted for inflation for some time, as has not been the value of homes over which somebody is double taxed. So if somebody who's, over $90,000, pays it based on the income sensitivity side, I think it is, and then also pays based on the value of their home over $225,000. We know how house values have gone up pretty significantly, so they're now bearing a double tax, just by virtue of being $90,000 one. And so we have to look into that and perhaps recommend that that be adjusted. Oh, and I agree, I don't know who said it, somewhere over there, I apologize, about splitting up the non-residential tax rate. We ought to seriously look at, second and third and fourth homeowners versus a business which resides here and employs people, and how do we tax them? And they should not be the same, and I agree, I think it was you, Jay, who said there ought not to be, incentive for people to use the non-residential tax rate who are in fact residents. And I've heard accountants talking to their clients about doing that very thing. So there ought to be some examination of that to make sure that we actually tax appropriately those who reside here, businesses, and second and third homeowners, or whatever the case may be.
Thanks, Jeff.
Just a few brief comments on the revenue side of the equation, and I'll go to cost containment, and that is, I think we need to be really careful about conversations around shifting to more of an income revenue, more income in the revenue stream, because the problem that we have right now, the good problem that we have right now is that we're living off of, significant gains in the stock market. That's driving, a lot of our increase in income tax revenue. And fundamentally, if you look at over, a period of decades, there's a lot of variability in the income tax stream based on, the health of the economy, particularly in the stock market. So if you put all your eggs in that basket, you're going to end up with a lot of volatility in the ed fund, which then, really creates a lot of pain for school districts down the road. So I think there's a careful balance with property tax, which is a very stable revenue source, and income tax, which has a lot of variability. So just, some words of caution there. So on the cost side of the equation, I did submit a memo this morning to the commission with a few, again, some options to consider. And one of them, it ties back to my earlier comment about setting some sort of a growth target, or, a goal that people can, across the state, everybody can be thinking about and mindful of. And I do think it's important that, whatever we end up doing, we try to set some sort of a goal that we can put on the street and everybody can start marching towards. And, what the legislature may or may not do, that's another question. But tied to that, one of the options that I've proposed is some sort of an allowable growth mechanism. That essentially, or based on FY25 spending per pupil, where school districts are relative to the statewide average, they'd be given, sort of a range of growth limits that they'd have to live within. So, that's sort of one idea. Another option to consider would be a variation of that, but would, rather than imposing, a fixed sort of threshold, there'd be a requirement for a supermajority vote at the local level if you're going to exceed that growth target. So that's another variation of a theme. And then either, and also I think coupled with some of this, there are always going to be exceptions on the ground, and having some sort of a kind of a waiver mechanism, review mechanism for those extenuating circumstances would be important in any kind of solution that imposes fiscal constraints on districts. A third option to think about is one where there would be a committee established, a joint legislative administrative committee that would allow school districts to essentially bring forward waiver requests to be relieved of various unfunded or, well, even fund, whatever, state mandates that they feel are adding to their costs. And if they can make a case that doesn't, have have an impact on educational quality, equity, or health and safety of students, they could put forth a waiver request to be relieved of those obligations or burdens, if they can demonstrate the cost savings. So that's a third option to consider. But fundamentally, I think the way I'm looking at this is, this goes back to Emily Kornheiser's earlier. We can focus on sort of the financial levers that are going to drive policy outcomes, or we can try to come up with policy solutions. And I firmly believe that the best approach, the most direct and efficient approach, is to focus on the financial levers and provide districts with the flexibility of how they're going to operationalize those things, right? So I'll take student staff ratios as a great example, right? At a macro level, it sounds great, but when you get into individual districts, something like that may make total sense for one district, may not make sense for another district, and there may be other opportunities that are going to be more impactful for cost savings. So I think the best strategy is to let school districts figure out what's going to work for them, but with the basic principle that we're all in this together in terms of how we're looking to control the growth of education spending. An important note, I don't want anybody to think that they're left out of the picture, but with those growth limitations, those would apply to tuition payments going to independent schools from those school districts as well. So everybody's sort of playing by the same rules there. Another option I didn't put in my memo to the commission may also be to look at some of the ESSER funds and what those funds were being used for. What were originally, I think there were examples of things where they were originally sort of, short-term expenditures and then, may have turned into longer-term expenditures following the release of those federal funds. So I think perhaps digging into some of that might be fertile ground for the conversation around potential cost savings.
Thanks, Oliver. And Elizabeth.
Okay, so I have a couple of thoughts that are kind of more related to ideas that were already mentioned, so they're not new ideas. And then I have kind of a little bit of a question. In regards to some items that were on the VSA, VASBO, and VSBA memo, and Michael, I think, was the one who mentioned them earlier, was in regards to the excess spending being related to cost drivers, and it mentions class size, staffing levels. And then another one was talking about actual setting minimum of class sizes. So in regards to both of those things, I think there is a data collection that the AOE does in regards to like teacher staff salary survey information that probably could fuel some of the data that would back up where schools are in relation to those staffing size and class size. So I'm curious to know, is that part of the data request that's already being worked on or not? So that's one question. And you can answer or not, or we can talk offline about that. And then my second thought in regards to that, which is more of a comment, is that I think if decisions are made that something like that item is going to be one of the things that we move forward with and recommend setting minimums or things like that as part of our short-term or even long-term containment strategies, I think that the school districts are relatively proactive. Their boards, their superintendents, their business managers. So even if a decision is not made that is in direct correlation with that particular item, as we move through this budget season, if the conversation leans itself that that's one of the items we're exploring and really looking into, I think all school districts are going to literally take a focus on that and say, hey, they're talking about this. We all really need to focus on this in our own budget decisions right now because this is going to be a topic. So I just want to put forth that if we come up with, 2 or 3 strategies that we are going to focus on, I think what you'll see is that in school districts, they will start focusing on that also in their budget process, even before it becomes a change in the law or a change in the guidelines or any of those things. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. Another idea, as I'm listening to people talk, I heard mention about the universal meals and, cost shifting between general fund, ed fund. And I think this is something that maybe people, we talk a lot about that part of it, but I don't know if it's ever been discussed in regards to universal meals. My experience in school districts is universal meals has a certain rate per meal that they contribute. And so even if from the state level, it's coming out of general fund or ed fund at the state level, for our individual districts, many of our child nutrition programs were not necessarily fully self-sustainable before universal meals came out and before COVID and before the summer meals program. So many of them require a contribution from the general fund of our school districts to help pay for our child nutrition program above and beyond what was collected from parents or people able to pay for their children's meals. What I've seen and I've heard from many districts is that the amount of those general fund contributions in our budgets today are now larger than what they were prior to COVID, and definitely during COVID. We didn't require as much general fund transfer to subsidize those programs and make them not profitable, but break even, basically. Those general fund transfers we are doing internally are bigger with universal meals than what the rate was we were being reimbursed for during COVID. So that's just important for people to know. That's actually increasing the tax rate for taxpayers because it's coming out of our general fund instead, and that's hitting the ed fund in kind of the backwards way. So I just wanted to kind of share that. And then my last thing is I heard someone talking about other revenue sources, and both, when we talk about education spending, there is in every district a little bit of local revenue that kind of comes off the top. We have our total budget. There's local revenues that come in that we all collect for various reasons, small grants or interest or things like that come in. Maybe even tuition that is local tuition coming into our districts that we deduct first off of the top of our budget, and then our ed spending is the net of those two. But then there's also talk about federal funding, grants and things like that come in. And are we all as a state district in the state utilizing those funds or accessing those funds and spending them down? And is that something that we have data on to see how much was available and how much are districts actually accessing? So I'm curious about that. One mention is someone was just talking about ESSER funds. One of the biggest things about federal funding in the state of Vermont and school districts is many of our federal funding sources like IDEA B or Title I, they have pretty substantial restrictions on what we can spend those funds on. And so, and one of the rules concerning them is that you can't supplant. And supplant means you can't take something that you were previously funding with your general fund dollars and then fund it with a federal grant in the future, because that's considered supplanting. Instead, you have to use that new federal money for something that supplements or is new to your program. ESSER was very different. ESSER funding came in and we were allowed to use it towards services that were necessary and needed that may or may not have previously been funded by general fund. So I think that's an important differentiation, is looking at how much our school districts accessing of that funding, and what are the reasons why they're not accessing it. Is it because of restrictions on what that money can be spent for? Those are everything I have on my list.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate that. Before I attempt to summarize where I think we are, does anybody have something that occurred to them after their turn passed that they want to put in the room?
I could just respond to the data questions. So as part of our regional planning, we created reports at the supervisory union and school district level that mirror the data analysis at the state profile report. And so within that, we do have staffing. We're looking at staff per 100 students, but broken out by teachers, leaders, student services staff, and support services staff. As we've had further conversations in the field, they've talked about the importance of looking at these ratios related to core instructional classes. So that's some additional breakout that we are doing. But just to note for the group that we are working very closely with our supervisor unions and districts to drill down to that level so that they can look at that in comparison to how their districts staff compared to the region and compared to the state. And so everything that you've seen in the state profile report has also been broken down at the SUSD level and is compared to state averages and to the regional averages to show those points of comparison. So there's a data validation process in place now before those are published, but ultimately all of this data will come together to support not only the recommendations, but how that would compare and again, be tangible in ways of thinking about concrete opportunities for cost but also the broader work. So I just wanted to share that there is that type of reporting that's underway also, which is helping us to drill down and look at practical ways that this comes into play at SUs and SDs across the state. Thanks. Anyone else?
So, here is a thought that I would propose to the commission. The first one is we have a full commission meeting on November 4th, so that's not long from now. And I have a pretty good list, and also we'll look at the unapproved minutes of an outline, and caution about outline. We could determine not to ultimately have something put in the report, but in terms of the content of the report, I think it would make sense for this full commission to react to a summary of what you all shared should be in the report. And then we can have the discussion and start to zero down. If this is the topic we want, what do we actually want to say about it? I think that would be a good use of our time on November 4th. Zoe, you can also answer this later if you don't have it off the top of your head, but whatever additional data might be available by that meeting. So there may be a data presentation.
Yes, and the other point I didn't respond to was around just how the some of these programs work. So the Universal School Meal Program was cited, and so I didn't come today with all that information around how the state money is leveraged to draw down additional federal money. So there's been a lot of intentionality around that, but I think it'd be helpful for the team to share that and communicate how it's structured and to what degree it's meeting the expectations. I think that that's something that comes in.
And that makes me think too, and turnaround time is always going to be a challenge, so we'll take what is feasible, frankly, but the finance subcommittee meets next week. This idea of making sure that if we're talking about a strategy, that we have the data we need to weigh the pros and cons of a strategy is there may be a lot of data we want to look at, and we need to focus right now on viable short-term cost containment options and having that data. So if the finance subcommittee is doing any sort of look back through this set of brainstorms or the other set, they may also be able to say, what data do we have and not have? And to the extent that any of that is, I'm struggling with predetermining what your answer would be because you don't know what it is until someone says, Zoe, would we have this available for us? But I think that could be something the finance committee.
Well, I mean, Emily's not here, so maybe we can convey this to her if we come to some sort of consensus, but I'm concerned about spending time next week at our meeting looking at national models of funding, because it feels like that's longer term work when we've just gone around and put some pretty concrete ideas that would be needed to be embedded into a report if we're gonna meet our charge. And so I think my preference would be to have presentations of data that are connected to some of these ideas. And sort of put on hold, at least until after the meeting on the 4th. Sort of, even looking at the PICUS report, feels like that there's no urgency around that, from my perspective. The urgency is around how can we influence the budget process that we're currently in and meet our charge for report due on December 15th. So that way I know that might put a bit of a monkey wrench in the presentations that were on deck. I don't know how other people in finance might feel about that, but it just feels like finance committee's engaged in a sort of a different longer term work when it starts to go down the road of looking at other funding models.
I agree. The Picus report is, an ideal report. I would like to hear more about it at a later date, but I think that later date would be after January, not prior to our December 15th recommendation.
I mean, does the finance committee, I feel a little funny talking about it without the chair, but the majority of the finance committee is here. And so to the extent that, does the finance committee want to rethink its agenda for next week? I mean, I can certainly reach out to, Emily, but it may be more meeting, I don't know. I can do that as chair or someone from the finance committee. I agree with Nicole. It's kind of my point. I think that those are really important pieces of information, but those are about the fundamental overhaul part of this, which we aren't gonna be able to do by December.
My thought is we can do both and, right? And the reason for that is I think, to the point around really not prejudging the strategies. I think there are some deeply ingrained beliefs around what will work and will not work in education that are very unique to how Vermont has functioned. And I think there is an opportunity to kind of put that in a broader context around, well, what does the research say, right? So I think just that at least kind of high level framing as we're looking at these strategies would be important. And then I hear the point around getting more refined to look at analysis that will support our evaluation. I just need to work with the team to understand to what extent that would be delivered for next Monday, just because that wasn't what we had crafted from the last session. But we had done some preliminary analysis that at the statewide level that we were validating. I just need to go back and flush that out and see what we're at.
I hear the point about maybe Monday's agenda changing a little. I would be wary of saying we shouldn't explore those things until January. In part because I think part of what we have bounced around as well is like, let's make sure that we have something on the table for some of the discussions that we think are gonna come up. And I think that that is something that will come up.
Yeah, Ficus is gonna come up.
And so I think if we haven't touched it at all, that will be a problem. I take Zoe's point. I guess part of it is, and I'm embarrassed that I don't know more details on this being on the finance subcommittee, but I'm curious what the national view is on Monday. Like, is it just looking at formula, or is it looking at some of these other things, guidelines, structure, delivery system? Like, I don't know. And if it is, maybe that is valuable. If it's just looking at funding formula, I could take that point that maybe this coming Monday doesn't have to be the time that we look at that. But I don't know what the full scope of that sort of national comparison is gonna be. Because that wasn't it wasn't only funding formula and Picus. He had points about
Sure,
some of the delivery system structure.
Delivery and rates.
Staffing, class size, all of these are kind of embedded within a broader research context.
Yeah.
And understanding of how different states can implement that and what those results are.
Yeah.
So I just think that basic framing as we're looking at the strategies is helpful.
I have no problem with basic framing. I just think we cannot keep not having the conversation about short-term strategies in this committee.
And that's my concern too. The long-term piece outputs the national, this is my third year in Vermont, so I've spent a lot of time studying national, international systems. So if that's something helpful to the rest of the committee, that's one thing, but just speaking for myself, I really want to look at those short-term cost containment pieces and how they impact the next 2 years' budgets. Keeping in mind that those other conversations are still very important.
Go ahead, Oliver.
How long is the finance committee scheduled for? Duration?
It's usually hours.
It was like 10 to 2 or.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a conflict, so I'm either gonna.
Might be helpful to chunk it, right? So
I'm just looking, I'm looking back from December 15th to the commission's meeting on the 4th, right? And is the commission meeting after the 4th, between the 4th?
So we have 2 full commission meetings scheduled before the report is due.
Right,
And
okay.
so, yeah.
But
And those dates are November 4th and
In December. Thank you, second.
so the 18th, we do not have a full commission meeting.
The 18th would be a subcommittee. Not that the commission couldn't add meetings, but just in terms of our original cadence.
yeah, I want to just echo Nicole's concerns. I'm just really concerned about the timeline. And I think you're going to need every available minute you have to focus on some of these short-term solutions.
So I wonder if, frankly, November 4th, I think we look at an outline of both components of the report, which is, what should the report include? And a list of cost containment strategies. They were surfaced here today. It would be helpful to that discussion if the Ed Finance Committee was able to dig into that next week.
That's where I was going with it. We're not going to have a very productive
Exactly.
conversation on the board if that doesn't happen.
Right, and I can convey that and we can decide who conveys that. But I think the point I'm making is, we're gonna have that discussion on November 4th with or without the benefit of the Finance Committee. We're gonna have to. So I think it would be helpful for the Finance Committee, to the extent that it can, to resurface the sticky note brainstorm, I mean, it's the same. I mean, largely the list is comparable, and
It is possible. It happens with fair regularity to ask for an extension of that time frame. And I think you've got Representative Kornheiser and myself, and Representative Condon, and we don't have a returning chair of education. Usually a request goes to the chairs of the committees that touch the bill, and you can get granted an extension. And what the legislature gives, the legislature can change. It's not.
right, and I don't think that, I mean, the commission could certainly ask for that. I'm not sure an extension changes the fundamental need for the General Assembly to take action this session. And so this commission's job is to inform that action. So
I think there's more than that too, because it went back to my superintendent days, Mike, but if I don't have a signal on where you're going,
exactly.
and I'm working with my boards, I'm trying to develop a budget, that's really difficult. I think the whole focus should be, since that deadline's in there, we should do everything we can to focus on that, and then everything afterwards, hopefully the system is gonna be great for Vermont for the future, that's wonderful, but we've got to address that first chapter first.
I couldn't agree more. This is not just a report to the legislature, it's a report to all of Vermont, and particularly, you know.
And that's the comment I've been making since the meeting in July, that that's the challenge that my colleagues across the state feel, that we're crafting budgets based on information that is uncertain at this point. All we can control is what we have in our own budget. And at this point in time, for most of my colleagues, that means making significant cuts to educational programs. So if we can get some idea of what that outlook and recommendation is to the legislature, that will help us. I think that'll help our boards, that'll help everyone in our organizations.
Can I ask a question? I've heard several times, a minimum class size. I keep hearing the governor propose that, but it didn't come to my committee. What happens if you've only got 4 kindergartners in your grade? And I have several schools that have been in that predicament. What happens if we say you have a minimum class size of 8?
So, and I absolutely understand the question. We only have a few minutes left. I want to make sure we have an opportunity for public comment. I think the short version of the answer is, it's been surfaced as something we should discuss.
Okay.
And then have a discussion about exactly that thing. I think there's
Put that on then. Or
well, it's one of the many things. There's many things on this list, and I don't think we have time to kind of pick and choose which ones we go down.
Other states and use averages.
Yeah. Exactly, and there would, I think, even among the cost containment strategies, there needs to be, whether you call it a waiver or, amendments. I think that the challenges are delivery system is sometimes by choice and sometimes by not by choice. And those are the things that I think that the commission will have to wrestle with. So I think we have a pretty good sense of what we need to talk about on the 4th. I think I will reach out to the finance subcommittee as a whole and just sort of summarize what we talked about here to the extent that we can inform the conversation that happens on Monday. And, given that, I think, let me make sure that I'm not skipping anything else on the agenda. I'm not. So I want to give folks the full amount. We are a little bit late, but I think we can go past it. If there are members of the public that want to share, before we switch gears. If we have too many people who want to talk, I might have to shorten the time for each. Everyone will have a chance, and that is mostly because we have to change locations and prep for this evening's input session. So I saw at least one hand in the room. Folks on the screen can also raise their hand. Why don't you start and identify yourself and
something. I'm Tom Frazier from Roxbury. And what you're all discussing today, it's all kind of too late for us. Our school's been closed basically due to Act 127 and the frantic pace that everything took at that point. We're a small school in a partnership with Montpelier. We had basically no representation. We had 2 people on a 9-member board. So 5 members of the Montpelier board closed our school. And I would just ask that the state put a moratorium on closing small schools, because the evidence is not there that it saves money. It's where everybody goes when they think they want to save tax dollars. Montpelier latched on to this $1.5 million figure that they said it cost to support Roxbury. But the fact is that most of that money was not going to go away. You still had to educate the kids. We still had over $600,000 of administration costs that wasn't going to go away. So the savings are just not there. And the effect that it has on a small community goes so far beyond any savings in tax dollars. I mean, it's torn our community apart. We have a building now that we don't know how we're going to support. The school district put out a survey geared toward giving them the cover they needed to cut us loose. Because if everybody in Roxbury answered the survey, it would still be, the numbers in Montpelier would outweigh. So I would just say that closing small schools has such an effect, and luckily Calais and Worcester were able to save their school, at least temporarily, but the superintendency is still planning on closing that school by draining the kids out of it. They're gonna take the 6th grade. In our case, they took the 5th and 6th grade both out, and then said we had small numbers, so they closed our school. So it's a playbook that's being used by superintendents. And I think that, it behooves the state to keep the small schools, because the small schools is where the numbers are increasing. People don't want to live in Montpelier. They can't afford to live in Montpelier. They go to the small schools, small towns, because they appreciate small schools. And I can't tell you how many people come. We have a greenhouse in Roxbury. Young families come to our greenhouse, and they don't know what they're going to do now. They have, some of them are homeschooling. Some have gone to St. Michael's, they've gone in Monica's. They are making alternative choices that they're being forced into when they live right, half a mile away from a small school that was doing very well. We went through a lot of hard times, our school, but it had come out the other side, and we had good teachers, good staff, good principals, and now it's all gone. The building is vacant. And I think it just behooves the state to forget about the national picture. We don't fit the national picture. And just put a moratorium on closing small schools, let people take a breath and find some funding mechanisms, which obviously, according to Ann, are not there, that would actually help small schools instead of always pointing the finger Okay, thank you.
All right. Appreciate this. I'm gonna adjourn for today. And then if members of the commission could, before you get up and take a break, we have not moved in a while. It would be great to regroup. Actually, maybe I'm gonna adjourn. We're adjourned. Actually, I need a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Mike, do you mind giving us a logistic where we're headed? And how what's the best way to get there?
Or can we go?
Yes.
You can totally get there from here. You can go out the door, you turn to the left, go to the end of